Broadcasting your inclusion journey online, 18th to the 26th of November. You're listening to RIBA Radio.
You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, the headquarters of the Royal Institute of British Architects, with me, Marsha Ramroop. I'm the Director of Inclusion here at the RIBA. We're 12 hours down, 16 hours to go in bringing you 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything you do, and it's all rooted in the behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. We're talking socioeconomics, we're talking LGBTQ plus lives, we're talking disability, we're talking more CQ knowledge. Welcome to day 4 of RIBA Radio.
RIBA Radio with Marsha Ramroop.
You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, the headquarters of the Royal Institute of British Architects, with me, Marsha Ramroop. I'm the Director of Inclusion here. We're basically halfway through our drive to bring you 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything that you do. It's all rooted in the behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. Now, last week, we gave you a bit of an overview of CQ. We talked about unconscious bias. We talked about the RIBA Inclusion Charter and what's been done up until now with regard to inclusion in architecture. We also examined that first CQ capability, CQ Drive. How much do you want to work with those who are different from you? And what motivations can you work on, especially when it's tough? Yesterday, we took a look at CQ knowledge and the lived experiences of women and racialised groups. And coming up today, it's the second of our 2 days talking CQ knowledge. What do you know? What are you thinking about? What do you need to know? We're looking at the different lived experiences of underrepresented people in architecture, as well as allyship. So we're talking socioeconomic diversity, LGBTQ plus lives, and disability today, with another fantastic lineup of people from you to learn from. Chris Hildry, Jules Pipe CBE, who's the GLA Deputy Mayor, Philip Watson and Karen Mosley, and from HLM. We've got Adam Nathaniel Furman and Joshua Mardell, Tabs the Butch Gardener, Christina Riley, Shani Danda, Jane Simpson, Ed Warner. As always, a programme not to be missed. And that's after today's
Shock Stats.
Now, according to the ARB's annual report 2020, only 68% of architects share their demographic data. And of that 68%, only 1% say they have a disability. Now, according to various sources, between 18 and 20% of the UK working population has a disability. So there's alarming underrepresentation here. On the flip side, LGBT people who came out can be as much as 20% more productive. That's according to the Manager's Guide to LGBTI Inclusion, Pride in Diversity report. Oh, you know, I think I'm doing rather well with the whole technical stuff so far. What are we on day 4? I really got to tell you this story, actually, because, there's misheard lyrics, right? And everyone knows of Peter Kay. If you haven't seen it, check out Peter Kay misheard lyrics on YouTube. But there's also misheard lives. So I came across this good old Twitter. Good old Twitter, you know, it's a cesspit of trolls half the time, but the other half is actually quite nice. And this guy, Declan Lawn, he tweeted this. My daughter just told me a brilliant story about a teacher asking a pupil to bring her the guillotine, you know, the paper cutter. And the kid misheard and was gone for ages. When they came back, they had the whole school's Gaelic team. They went around every classroom and pulled out 20 confused lads. But what was a really great thing is some of the comments on this. So someone else has responded saying, I lived in a small village in France for a while at university, and one of the locals informed us cheerily that there was a psychopath. And they were all going round in pairs to the phone box and to the shops and for about 2 months until they realised actually it was a cycle path they'd been told about. And then another one said, my mum used a saying once, no manners in Ireland. And this person spent the next 10 odd years thinking Irish people were really rude. She then went and visited Ireland and found everyone to be lovely, which they are. And she asked her mum why she thought them to be rude, and the mum just looked really confused. She then learned that the saying was, no man is an island. Gotta love Twitter for that sort of thing. Now, the architecture profession is still observationally and statistically overrepresented by white, male, middle-class, privately educated individuals who have attended prestigious Russell Group universities or independent architecture schools. And what does this mean for the sector and, crucially, for society? Now, when discussing these issues to hand in our profession, it's really important to pull apart the one of socioeconomic diversity and not to forget the white working class experience. And to discuss this, I'm joined by architect Chris Hildry, the GLA Deputy Mayor of Planning, Regeneration and Skills, Jules Pipe, CBE, architect Philip Watson from HLM, and Karen Mosley, Managing Director at HLM. Thank you all very much indeed for joining me. If I can start by asking you, Chris, how would you introduce yourself and what's your relationship with class?
It's a very good question. I mean, I would always introduce myself just, as an architect, really, or architect and designer, I suppose. My experience with class, though, is an interesting one. I mean, I was fortunate enough to go to an independent school, but it was a strange experience because my dad taught there, so I got to go for next to nothing. So from an early age, I was surrounded by people who had different opportunities than I did. Lots of sort of skiing events I couldn't go to and things like that. And then in university, I went to Edinburgh University, first of all, which I think definitely has a huge demographic towards the more affluent, which is interesting. And then after that, I went to the Bartlett, which again has a sort of similar mix. And certainly that's something I've seen in architecture is it is definitely a very privileged profession, which leans heavily in that direction.
Thanks, Chris. And if I can ask you, Philip, the same question, please. Introduce yourself and what's your relationship with class?
I don't introduce myself by my class generally. I'm an architect, but I am working. I come from a working class background. I grew up on a council estate on the east of Birmingham, and going to university just wasn't a thing that was on the agenda, really. No one had really heard about it. No one talked about it, not at school, not amongst my family and friends. It was, it just wasn't really an option. So, because, as we talk about this, I think, it's about those layers, those barriers that present themselves to people from working class backgrounds that prevent the amount of people who went to comprehensive school in the industry. I mean, there was a report that was published in September, Social Mobility in the Creative Industries, and it found that architecture was dominated by the privileged. In other words, about 90% of people in the UK go to a comprehensive school, but they make up only 45% of the architectural profession. So, if you go to a private school, you're 5.5 times more likely to become an architect. It's a difficult thing talking about class because it's very nuanced. I grew up in a very supportive, loving kind of nuclear family. There was nothing wrong with that per se. It was just this lack of experience of higher education and awareness of opportunities, lack of funds. Crikey, if I were 18 now and I was looking down the barrel of 85 to 90,000 pounds worth of student debt, would I become an architect? Very unlikely.
I'll come on to that in a bit. Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Karen, can I ask you, how would you introduce yourself and what's your relationship with the term class?
I think, well, generally at the moment, I introduce myself as a managing director of HLM Architects because I am quite proud of the sort of opportunities that I've had and been able to progress to where I have from where I started. So I try and use that as well to showcase sort of my story, I suppose, which is, I guess, what the purpose of all of this conversation is about. I think in terms of class, I think it's something that we get worried about. I mean, class to me when I was younger was something quite scary, that I didn't think I was in the same sphere as others, and that really eroded my confidence. And I think as you grow older and you learn from the different experiences of others, you learn that we've all got quite different things to bring. And I think when you can start to break down those barriers, it helps break down the barriers of class, that we're all very similar in many respects. So yeah, I mean, I was from a working class background, and again, that's why I think I'm quite passionate about where I've progressed in my career, to be able to help others have the confidence and see that there are opportunities for people of a similar background to me to progress in the architectural profession.
Jules, thanks very much indeed. Jules Pipe, CBE, is the GLA Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills. If I can ask you a slightly different question, if I may, which is how much does class have to play within the idea of regeneration?
Well, I don't think that generally the sector looks at it in terms of class. I think it's, yes, socioeconomic. The socioeconomic state of an urban regeneration initiative is obviously at the heart of what that's determining going forward on a development. But I'm not sure the issue of class as much plays an immediate role, but it may well be something useful exploring purely as an academic exercise if one was looking at how these things play out.
Coming back to your point, Philip, about the profession being overwhelmingly people who've had access to privilege. What do you think that means for the profession?
Well, I mean, ultimately, I think the profession is probably losing access to a cohort of very talented, creative people who have a relevant voice to delivering great architecture. We're kind of turning our back on a big pool of talent. Is the bottom line of it, really, isn't it? We're missing out on relevant voices, and we're narrowing our field of view in terms of the lived experience of the profession as a whole, and that probably narrows our ability to create great community environments, maybe.
I saw you nodding away there, Chris. You agree with that idea?
I do, yeah. I think it's not only about the sort of taking people's lived experience and putting it into the city, but it's also about getting that lived experience and I think bringing that as something that helps shape the city for people who also live that experience in the future. So I think given that the profession is certainly has a high proportion of people who may have come from a background of privilege, I think the difficulty is the fact that that privilege, if you like, kind of persists because of the obstacles that are put in the way between somebody who may want to become an architect and ultimately becoming an architect. So everything from long university courses to the kind of clients you need to get. Ultimately, if you're in a position where you can afford a bespoke building, you're either an affluent individual or an institution, and so having those relationships is really key. But I think also, when you're looking at at sort of the privilege of creating a space, we need to remind ourselves that architecture is not, it's not a private endeavor. Whenever you undertake a piece of architecture, you are designing for the client, but you're also imposing something into the public. And in that sense, I think architecture has a duty to engage with the people who live with the consequences of that. And that's best done if you have people who understand how critical that imposition can be.
Well, we certainly will be talking about that as we go through the next hour. We're discussing socioeconomic diversity with architect Chris Hildry and Philip Watson. We've got GLA Deputy Mayor for Planning Regeneration Skills, Jules Pipe, CBE, and Karen Mosley, Managing Director at HLM Architects. Coming up later today on this, our second CQ Knowledge Day, we're talking LGBTQ plus lives and disability with campaigner Shani Danda, who incidentally used to work for the RIBA. Yesterday, on our first day covering CQ Knowledge, we explored the lived experience of women and those from racialised groups. If you'd like to catch up as soon as we can, those conversations will be subtitled accurately and up on the RIBA YouTube channel as soon as we can. There was a very, very powerful discussion with Melody Lung, Farshid Musavi and Roma Agrawal in yesterday's panel about women. So do recommend you catch up with that. We're discussing socioeconomic diversity this morning, and I'm joined by architects Chris Hildry and Philip Watson, as well as Deputy Mayor for the GLA Planning Regeneration Skills, Jules Pipe, CB, and Karen Mosley, the Managing Director at HLM. If I can come to you, Jules, just before the track there, Chris was talking about, spaces needing to be informed by a diversity of people. So what are you trying to do to address this particular element of planning and making sure the spaces in London is as inclusive as they could possibly be?
Well, I mean, at City Hall, we think it's absolutely crucial, that those people who are shaping and designing London really do represent the diversity of London's communities. And as we just heard earlier, often that isn't the case. Women sorely underrepresented. I think it's only about 32% of architects' jobs in the last survey that I saw, and that's actually down from around 2008 when it was up at 40%. So it's going in the wrong direction. BAME architects continue to experience discrimination in the workplace, along with LGBTQ plus architects as well. Too few disabled architecture students, are successfully progressing their careers and finding long-term placements. And we think that that underrepresentation damages the development of London. It undermines all our efforts to achieve what we call good growth, growth that's socially and economically inclusive and environmentally sustainable. And architects, I think, are just so crucial, playing a strategic role in shaping the city. They translate the needs of people from all walks of life and backgrounds into our built forms. So we really have to all work harder to make sure that they reflect the makeup of the people that they represent.
So, but what can you, in your role, do to try to encourage that, do you think?
Well, a couple of years ago, we launched the Good Growth by Design programme, and that promotes quality and inclusion across the built environment in everything that we do, providing guidance and design review and advocacy. But a major part of the programme is dedicated to EDI in the built environment, and it's one of the programme's 6 pillars. And it's a really call to everyone engaged in London's architectural and built environment professions to help realise the Mayor's vision for good growth. So we've got a whole series of projects. One of the biggest one was the Supporting Diversity Handbook that we produced, and I urge anyone who hasn't heard of it to go online onto our website and see it. I was really pleased that RIBA itself adopted it as part of its core materials. And that really is structured around the different stages of an architect's education and career, and provides resources and help for each stage. But it's not just for architects. It's translatable across all sorts of built environment professions. And we're undertaking a whole series of specific actions as well, and activities. You know, we've got the architecture and urbanism framework. So it's the new panel for procurement. So we're ensuring that all the practices that will be on that panel, so for those call-off contracts for the public sector and other people who use that framework, we're ensuring that it's far more representative of those who live and work in London, rather than you know, the current makeup of the profession.
Thank you for that, and I think procurement's a really major part of how we can encourage diversity and inclusion within the profession, because the money is always where it starts. Karen, if I can ask you as well about, you know, the work that's being done at HLM to encourage a diverse and inclusive experience, but also in terms of encouraging a diversity of people to join the firm. What are you doing to try to create change there?
Yeah, I think you've hit that. We're sort of taking a two-pronged approach to this. You know, we're obviously focusing on our own business and what we're doing internally. So, you know, the sort of the events that unfolded last year made us think more about what the support sort of groups that we had internally, and we created a diversity, inclusion and belonging group, which I sit as lead on that, and champion that at board level. You know, we're reviewing our recruitment strategy in terms of, we've invested in a new recruitment platform to make sure that we're reaching out to the widest network, but also in terms of how we assess applications. We're doing training internally and raising awareness. What we're trying to do as well is, I think my main focus, because of where I came from, I came through the youth training scheme when I was 17 as an apprentice. So I'm really passionate about the apprenticeship route. We were part of the Trailblazer group, and being in the north, I'm trying to make sure we're trying to level up that opportunity. And in Sheffield, I'm delighted to say we're probably now going to have level 6 and level 7 running. So we're going into schools, and we've got a programme that backtracks all the way back to age 5, working with the RIBA and their schools ambassador programme, but creating this pathway, sprinkling, you know, ideas at that really early age, because apparently by the age of 7, people have already determined what they can't do. So what we're trying to do is showcase through role modelling and our outreach programme, feeder schools, primaries that feed through to secondaries through to sixth form, then showcase the apprenticeship route, so that we can try to widen the pipeline, create more diversity, because there's only so much that we can do internally. It's our pipeline, you know, when we're looking at it, the sort of unblocking of those barriers for people entering. And, you know, the apprenticeship is really fundamental to that. It can really help to unlock that potential that's sitting within our cities.
Yeah, I mean, Philip, you know, that apprenticeship scheme, it could be the key, because you mentioned that you would, if you had to enter architecture today, you may not have, because of the amount it costs to become an architect these days. But apprenticeships may well be a different way forward into the profession.
Yeah, absolutely, Marsha. I mean, like Karen, I actually stumbled my way into the architecture profession through the youth training scheme in the early 80s. I had no idea what architecture was or anything. I just stumbled into this thing where I ended up printing drawings and making the tea in an architect's office, and seeing that actually, look, you could draw and make a living out of it. And that really resonated with me. I mean, I did end up going to a Russell Group university, but it was only through that training apprenticeship that I, you know, got access to the opportunity, if you like, became aware of it. So, and of course, the funding kind of landscape has completely changed since my day. I mean, I got a full grant and there were no fees. You know, going to university, that was the most money I ever had when I went to university. Whereas now that's very different, of course. And I think, you know, that 85, 90K barrier to becoming an architect is daunting. It's absolutely daunting. And if you're from a working class background, that's going to put you off. It really is. And I think this, you know, this, I'm going to ramble off the subject here, but there is this thing that really bugs me in this profession where people from middle class privileged backgrounds think that getting into architecture, the architecture profession, is just, life's a meritocracy. You know, if you're good, you'll succeed. And you know, lots of good people do succeed, but it's these barriers that present themselves to people from underprivileged backgrounds that privileged people just don't experience. And I think there needs to be more understanding of those barriers by those people.
And thankfully, that's what RIBA Radio is for. Chris, you're nodding away there. You know, we're trying to bring this understanding about, you know, actually the reality of lives of people who may not even know that architecture's a possibility for them. It just closed off. I mean, what are your views on not only what Philip said, but how we can move forward as a profession here?
Well, I think Phil's exactly right when he talks about the dangers of the view of meritocracy, because, you know, when you perceive something to be a meritocracy, it almost escapes it from the opportunities of chance and luck and, you know, being born into a certain environment. And people do suffer as a result of, you know, their backgrounds. And I think, you know, you just have to look at the profession today, and, you know, whether it is the fees that you have to pay today, or, you know, the persistence of unpaid internships, for example. There are all these obstacles that do sit in the way between somebody who may be interested in architecture and practicing architecture. And ultimately, I think, you know, one of the difficulties that architecture faces is the fact that most people don't really perceive themselves as having some kind of agency or voice within that. You know, I mean, I was similar to Phil. I kind of got quite lucky and stumbled into architecture because I liked the things that were involved in the course rather than architecture. For example, you know, when I went to university in first year and somebody told me they have a favorite building, I was perplexed by that. It was a whole new concept to me. But I think to most people, as it was to me, you know, most people see the built environment as, you know, being made of stone and steel and being a very static thing. And it's only really once you've gone through that training, you see how much of a thing in flux it is. And actually there is a lot of opportunity to shape it. But for your average person on the street, you know, at most they might see a notice posted on a lamppost before something large happens, or a piece of community consultation, which, you know, also stands to have some improvement in it. So I think engaging people is not only about removing the obstacles for people who want to become engaged, but also making people aware that being engaged is something, you know, that is very much an opportunity that's there. So I think we need to lower the drawbridge and invite people in, and do both of those things at the same time.
Sounds like a plan. We're discussing socioeconomic diversity with architects Chris Hildry, Philip Watson, GLA Deputy Mayor for Planning and Regeneration Skills Jules Pipe, and Karen Mosley, Managing Director of HLM Architects. Coming up later, we have Adam Nathaniel Furman and Joshua Mardell, the authors of Queer Spaces, a book due out next year, alongside Christina Riley and Tabs Butch Gardener, talking about LGBTQ plus lives. Currently, we're discussing socioeconomic diversity, and I'm joined by architects Chris Hildry and Philip Watson. We've got the GLA Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills, Jules Pipe, CBE, and we have the Managing Director at HLM, Karen Mosley. If I can come to you, Jules, you know, how can we measure, you know, whether we're making progress around socioeconomic diversity in terms of, you know, the way the GLA might engage with the built environment?
Well, I think it's absolutely crucial that, you know, it's the first step that we can take in getting this right and having the built environment sector more reflective of the society it serves by getting the data right. It is the first step, and that's why we've convened the 6 built environment professional institutes, and we've got that shared aim to work together towards a built environment sector with equity and inclusion absolutely at its core. And what's it doing? First off, it's focusing on creating consistency across data collection. You know, we've got everyone to acknowledge that having that clear and reliable data on the makeup of the wider sector is that crucial, important first step towards making meaningful change. And there's also a really shared commitment to focus on training and embedding EDI in what the built environment sector does. So I'm really pleased that the 6 big institutes are on board with that.
And just for the record, the RIBA, and indeed me,
You
I
are.
am involved with that.
You absolutely are. It's RIBA's there, the RTPI, Institute of Civil Engineers, the surveyors are there, Chartered Institute of Building, and the Landscape Institute. Those are the six key professional institutes that are around the table.
Philip, what would you like to see happen around socioeconomic diversity? What in utopia, in our world of dreams, where we are working towards it, you know, what would socioeconomic diversity looks like what in architecture and the built environment?
Well, if we're going to go full metal jacket utopia, it would be free access to education for all. But I don't think we're quite there yet, are we? I think there's some easier wins. I think we need to raise aspirations in schools. You know, we need to fund schools properly. You know, even the Department for Education's own report in June of this year said the funding gap between state and private schools has doubled in the last 10 years. Okay, there's another barrier. You know, it's just layer upon layer. So we need to fund schools properly. We need to give better advice and information in schools. You know, poor advice from teachers and careers advisors really held people back in my day. There's this in poorer areas, there's a real push for vocational and non-academic careers, and we've got to really challenge that. And, you know, so financial support, familiarising poorer communities with higher education, creating new pathways into the profession in the way that Karen was describing. I think these are the things that we can do right now. But you know, the big one, as you've already identified, Marsha, is it's all about the money at the end of the day, isn't it? You know, and if we can get better access to higher education for people from poorer backgrounds, then that's what will really change matters.
Karen, you've got these schemes in place. You're working with schools. You're quite passionate about this area. What do you hope will come of those schemes, and what are your timeframes and timelines?
Well, probably the timeline might be longer than I might be in the profession, but that's what we've got to work on. You know, we can drive, as Philip and I are directors in our business, we can drive things within our business and a culture of inclusivity, belonging, you know, and diversity. But we can only work with pipeline as well that's coming through. And so this is a long, slow burn of an initiative. But I think there's so many organisations that are doing so many brilliant things with schools. But I think it's actually getting into the system. It's making sure that those interactions are really powerful and meaningful. So it's aligning what we do with curriculum so that we're almost embedded from day one, you know, in the learning process, so that, you know, architecture and lots of other professions that aren't spoken about so widely are there right at the start. So, you know, I think that's a major thing. I think we have got, you know, to a certain extent, a free and accessible route now to architecture. And we just, you know, we need to see more uptake by universities for running level 6 particularly. There's a funding issue there that the Trailblazer group have been addressing. But, you know, I'm delighted I can go into schools now and really showcase this, and we want to see that in every city if possible, because that will really break down the barriers, I mean, the aspirations are quite high in some schools. We often talk about raising aspirations. Aspirations are there, they're just not being unlocked, and that's the duty. I mean, there's a duty for us to push up to government and try to make national change, which we you know, we have got voices in that area, but it's the duty upon us, perhaps the perceived privileged, that use that to then unlock those barriers. So let's, you know, that's employers and having, you know, having a real commitment to schools and doing that.
Chris, how do you unlock aspirations, do you think?
That's a big question. I mean, to my mind, I think there's kind of three areas which I think we can help things along. One is that transition into university. I mean, it's already been discussed about, you know, going into schools, and, you know, because architecture is not something that is taught explicitly in schools. But I think especially from people who maybe come from poor backgrounds and things, that the ability to mentor or coach people into architecture, what it is. There's a great organization called Arts Emergency that helps people from underprivileged backgrounds move into the arts. So more stuff like that I think is great. Then I think through the educational journey, I think doing everything you can to sort of lessen the gap between the haves and have-nots, if you like. So I mentioned unpaid internships earlier, which I think can be a massive discrepancy between those who can afford to do that and those who can't. The RIBA has done good work in clamping down on that for chartered practices. Personally, I think, you know, it's hard to clamp down on that entirely from the top down. If anything, I think it would be nice to see it almost inverted, so that if you want to record any time on your PDRs towards your part 3, you have to show that you were paid. So if it like almost sort of take away the demand for unpaid internships. But also I think it's about when you actually get into practice. And that's more challenging, because then you're talking about real world environment where, you know, networks matter, clients matter, who you know matters. And that's harder to actually balance. So what I've tried to do with that is to approach architecture in a way in which it doesn't necessarily result in a building as the end result. And I think actually diversification of the profession is something that is potentially a way to open opportunities to those who don't necessarily have access to the people who have the capital for a building. So architecture imbues you with this huge array of skills and a huge array of tools that you can actually do things to change the built environment. And it doesn't always have to be a building. So in my case, it was a project called Proxy Address, where it was about changing the way that the built environment works for those who are excluded from it, namely those people who are facing homelessness. And that's something where, you know, if I was looking down the barrel of just practicing architecture for buildings, I'd be looking at, well, we need to build the housing for people who are homeless, right? And that's decades worth of work. And in the meantime, today, tomorrow, the next day, more and more people are becoming homeless. So this is a way to use that architectural education to short circuit that almost and actually go directly to the people who could stand to benefit.
So in terms of actually creating an aspiration for even those people who might have used that space, you know, how can you start to build that, do you think, in them?
I mean, an aspiration in terms of, you know, an aspiration to engage with the built environment, I think you have to show agency, if that's what you mean. Yeah, I think you need to demonstrate to people that there can be agency. I mean, I remember I once did a project as a collaboration with an artist called Matthew Derbyshire, where we sort of took over a gallery, and we wanted to do an exhibition that would get people engaged with some of the questionable architecture that was going up in advance of the 2012 games in London. And we were kind of perplexed as to how a lot of this developer work was being, you know, pushed up at quite a rate. So we did this installation where we pretended we were going to demolish the gallery, wrapped it in hoarding, and presented what we could only describe as the worst building we could ever design. It was quite an interesting design exercise. And when it came to opening night, you know, we were hoping that people would come up and grab us by the lapels. We invited all the neighbors and everything. But in fact, you know, on the hoarding, it showed that on the ground level, there was a Tesco, and everyone was just really excited to be getting a Tesco. So actually, the project was a complete failure. But what was really interesting is what it revealed about people's attitudes towards bad architecture. Actually, it was more about the immediate impact for them rather than the questionable space design. And I think if you're going to get people to move beyond that immediate impact and look at the legacy of a project, you need to enable them with the agency to have a voice in that process.
Jules, that point about agency and voice, really important, and I'm sure you feel that you've got a role to play there. How do you give people agency?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're certainly keen to start engaging with young people and getting them into the process. The Mayor's teamed up with George Clark's education charity, Moby, and we're launching a design challenge to young Londoners between the ages of 11 and 24. And we want to see them prepare a master plan for the Royal Docks. And through this process, they'll learn more about the range of built environment careers. They'll get access to the Mayor's design advocates, and there'll be workshops and all sorts of events. So that's certainly how we'd like to get more interest from younger people in the sector. But I do agree with Karen that you can't start too early. And I say this more with my skills hat on than my built environment hat on. I think that absolutely not to try and trammel people into choosing careers early at primary school, but quite the opposite, to demonstrate to really young kids the kind of huge range of possibilities that exist out there and get them thinking from a young age that they can spend the rest of their education career thinking about what they might do when they're 18, 21 and beyond. I would say though about the sort of creating the pipeline, whilst that's absolutely vital and we've got to put a lot of effort into that, there is actually already, people coming out through the existing pipeline that aren't getting a fair deal. There are plenty of young women architects. There are plenty of BAME architects who are being overlooked. So as well as ensuring that we improve the pipeline, we've got to make sure at the end of that pipeline that there are the opportunities. So I'll come back to my point about procurement frameworks and making sure that they are fair and accessible for everybody.
And certainly, socioeconomic diversity is an intersectional place. Especially underrepresented, racialized groups are disproportionately affected by socioeconomics. Philip, if I may give you the final word, with regard to that agency piece and giving young people and a voice from those socioeconomic disadvantaged groups, what would you like them to hear from you?
Oh, crikey. I think it's all about opportunity. Everything we've been talking about here today is about opportunity and improving awareness, and in a way it's easier to talk about ethnicity and gender and age and disability and sexual orientation. These things are quite prominent, but the C word, class, it's quite a difficult and nuanced topic. I'd like to hear some really strong regional accents in quite powerful and prominent positions for once. That's when I'd start to feel, right, yeah, here's some agency. Here's someone who sounds like me in a powerful and prominent position. That's okay. There's my role model.
Well, Philip, we look forward to your nomination for president for the RIBA coming up soon. Architects Chris Hildrey, Philip Watson, GLA Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills, Jules Pipe, CBE, and Karen Mosley, Managing Director at HLM Architects. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. You can listen again to that conversation when we come off the live broadcasting today, and all of today's content is repeated on this Listen In link. Coming up in the next hour, we're talking LGBTQ plus lives, the difference between the communities, the issues they face, and the experience they'd like you to understand as well. And later, we'll be talking disability with Shani Danda.
It's the RIBA Radio Lucky Prize Draw.
It is the Lucky Prize Draw. We have 2 fabulous prizes to give away. Win a 2-night stay for you and a friend or lover in one of Mallinson's gorgeous woodland treehouse. I'll stop trying to do the sexy voice. I'm going to stay in my lane. Uniquely designed, these funky luxury retreats include fab things for a pampering stay like hot tubs, saunas, cargo net daybeds suspended above a stream beneath an oak canopy, and wood-burning stoves if it's chilly. The tree houses are a perfect way to get away from it all. Or you can win tickets to see the specials live and a night stay in Dublin as well. So to enter the draw, go to the RIBA Radio webpage and architecture.com. Just fill in the form, and the magic word you need is giraffe. Giraffe. The winners will be announced live during the last broadcast, and you can, just for entering, get a special poster. So it's definitely worth it. It's behind me in the studio here. Full terms and conditions can be found on architecture.com. You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects, with me, Marsha Ramroop, the Director of Inclusion at the RIBA. We're 13 hours down, 15 hours to go in bringing you 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything that you do. It's all rooted in the behavioural principle of CQ cultural intelligence. We've been talking socioeconomics, now we're talking LGBTQ plus lives, and later we're talking disability. It's more to help you with CQ knowledge. You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects, with me, Marsha Ramroop. I'm the Director of Inclusion here. We have got people moving around, enjoying the bookshop. If you're in London and want to pop in, 66 Portland Place is where you'll find us. Coming up today, on our second of 2 days, talking CQ knowledge. What do you know? What are you thinking about? What do you need to know? We're looking at different lived experiences of the underrepresented in architecture, as well as allyship. So we've been talking socioeconomic diversity. We're going to be exploring LGBTQ plus lives with Adam Nathaniel Furman and Joshua Mardell, Tabs to Butch Gardener, and Christina Riley. As always, the whole programme is not to be missed. After today's
Dish of the day.
Hello, my name is Stephen Waldron, running my small architect practice in the Welsh Brecon Beacons. This dish of the day is from when I was Iran country director for a major disaster relief agency, and where I and my small team managed local people in the building of some 130 new earthquake-resistant houses I had designed after the BAM earthquake on Boxing Day 2003. For my leaving do, a young Iranian couple on my team in BAM cooked this meal in the school corridor we were using to cook for 3,000 refugees daily. A Persian, pomegranate and walnut chicken stew. It brings back amazingly evocative memories, and I hope you really enjoy this dish.
LGBTQ plus is an acronym which encompasses so many identities, so many experiences. And I have to say, I've often wondered why they're grouped together and they're bandied together. One of our guests described it to me as a coalition of sorts. Another explained there's a hierarchy of acceptance within it, all of which we'll delve into. And we're really fortunate to have with us Adam Nathaniel Furman and Joshua Mardell, Tabs, the Butch Gardener, and Christina Riley. And rather than me describing them, I'll let them do that themselves. So I'd like to start with you, Adam, if I may. How would you describe yourself, and what is your relationship with the LGBTQ plus acronym?
Hi, thanks for having well, all of us on the show. I'm an artist and designer from an architectural background. So I studied architecture and worked in architecture for almost a decade, and then sort of moved out of it. My relationship with the LGBTQIA+ acronym is that I sort of float around between a few of the letters within the acronym, and have generally found quite a lot of solace and kinship within various sort of overlapping areas of that coalition over the course of my lifetime, and have frankly been saved by it. I probably wouldn't be around if it wasn't for people that I found through networks in London, thanks to the queer community.
Thank you for that. Christina, how would you describe yourself, and what's your relationship with the acronym?
Great, that's a huge question. Okay, so I'm Christina Riley. I'm a senior planner for a company called Quinn London, where we work. We build new buildings. We work on heritage projects in London, and also property projects in London. So it's a great company to work for. I do planning, so it's part of project management, and I've been in the construction industry now for getting on 30 years. I transitioned about 6 years ago while working at Balfour Beatty, and for me that was obviously life-changing. But basically since then I've been involved in LGBTQI+ activism in the workplace. I was a co-founder of Building Equality, which is the LGBT+ network for the construction industry. And last year we co-founded with some colleagues Constructability, which is a disability, non-visible disabilities and neurodiversity network for the construction industry as well. So quite a busy activist, and I've just on the back of hosting the diversity stage at London Build. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Christina. Joshua, if I can ask you, how would you describe yourself, and what's your relationship with the acronym?
Yeah, well, Josh is absolutely fine. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much. And I almost feel like singing over after the Bronski beat.
I know, love that, right?
Talking. So I mean, I'm a cis man. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a gay man, so the G and the Q kind of speak for me. The Q having perhaps more fluidity, more positive, perhaps part of the acronym. So I'm a Q as well, and I'm an architectural historian in the history of art department at the moment at the University of York. And really, I suppose my approach is informed by queerness as a kind of sensibility. I'm interested in saving stories and working on the marginalized and the forgotten, and trying to validate or foreground areas that are missing from architectural history. So in short, I'm sort of interested in recovering a wider range of experiences in the past, and in so doing, extending architectural history to everyone who can benefit from it. And I'm sure we're going to talk about the book on queer spaces, but it fits into that sort of idea of recovery. So that's who I am.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah, we'll certainly be talking about that shortly. And joining me here in the studio is Tabs. How would you describe yourself, and what's your relationship with the acronym?
Hi, my name's Tabs. I identify as a butch lesbian. I'm a composer by trade, a musician and composer. I started working in pop music about 10 years ago. About 5 years ago, I started a club night for lesbian, trans and non-binary people called Butch Please, which is at the Royal Vauxhall Tavern every month. And I'm also a gardening writer, and I'm a gardener. I started growing as a way to combat stress and anxiety, and I'm really interested in the intersection of wellness and growing, and accessibility to growing as well, and gardening. That's me.
Thank you. And would you agree that this acronym is supposed to encompass anyone who's not cis-het, where cis means cisgender, which denotes or relates to a person whose sense of personal identity or gender corresponds with their birth sex, and het is short for heterosexual and relates to someone who's attracted to what's traditionally described as the opposite sex? Is it everybody who's not that?
Well, I don't like to think of the LGBTQI+ community as that, because, I don't think we should be considered like the exception to the rule. I think, we are who we are. We are these people. We're not everyone who's not straight. And I think that that's not a very useful starting point. I also think it can be quite interesting because loads of people that I know, we don't, I mean, I certainly don't feel a huge connection to the LGBTQI acronym. I understand why it's important, but I think it is often an acronym which is used by straight people and mainstream society to describe what is a hugely diverse and varied group of people. And we're not all the same. In fact, we're all very different. We come together often under similar ideas, and we often campaign, and we come together under certain issues, of course, but a lot of the time we connect separately, and we connect with people who have actually, my lived experience as a butch lesbian is quite different to some other people, to the experience of a white cis gay man. Very, very, very different. And I think it can become dangerous to see our experiences as the same. I think once we start to lose some of the fact that we're different and accepting those differences in each other, then we can run into some kind of problems. So I think whilst it's a useful term, it can also be quite problematic, and it needs to be unpacked, I think.
Well, let's do a bit of that unpacking. I mean, Christina, what's your view on this grouping and bringing all these different identities and experiences together?
I think, LGBT, it's important to recognise that LGB is about sexual orientation, the T is about gender identity, the plus is often just shortens the acronym, but we often talk about intersex people, talk about queer people, queer identities, and people that are questioning their gender identity or sexuality. So I think it's really important to say that, and I always like to I prefer to actually use the words lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer questioning, as opposed to the acronym, because I think the identities can get lost within the acronym.
Well, that's certainly something that the racialized groups can identify with, in the same way, I suppose, how, black can mean so many things. Asians a continent rather than a skin color, ethnic minority, well, actually people who are not white make up the global majority. So, acronyms, would you say overall are quite problematic, Christina?
I think it's, in some way it's good because it's, for a lot of people, you instantly know what, or people think they know what LGBT plus means, but I mean, there's so much more to it, isn't there? And as you say, with like the BAME identities, each person within that identity and the intersectionality across the umbrella of LGBTQI plus, everybody is different, and you can lose somebody's identity by somebody that might identify as queer. If you just use LGBT as the acronym, you're gonna miss out somebody's identity. So I think it is really important. We can use the acronym, but also it's really important to actually talk about the individual identities.
And really pulling apart, who is it we're really speaking to, and what is it we're trying to achieve by using the acronym, presumably. Adam, if I can talk to you about your book, how did you come to the place where you felt you needed to write a book about queer spaces?
So Josh and I are co-editors of the book, and it's actually, speaking of large and incommensurable coalitions, we've got over 50 writers, so it's and over 100 spaces. So it's a kind of very broad range of spaces, and that was done intentionally, so that we wouldn't have authorial control over, totally defining what a queer space was, but rather it would come from a plurality of voices, a plurality of locations, chronologies, and alternative histories. So a kind of plural recovery of different histories from around the world. And it was very important. Josh, I'll let you say something, but it was very important for me, coming from a very much a design background. I studied design in architecture school, as many architects are dyslexic, finding it very difficult to access a lot of the theory around queerness and find a way of relating it to design practice in education. And having a kind of quite sort of accessible publication that talked about the kind of shared history of queer spaces and all the kind of diversity and richness in, you know, and genius and brilliance that comes with that wasn't really present. And it would have been a very beneficial thing for myself, and I think lots of other people in my generation, to have had. And so it's sort of it feels quite personal to create that now, sort of, I guess, a very visual, very accessible, but very, very broad and open, so not one authorial voice definition of queer spaces throughout history. But Josh has an equally personal perspective on it.
Yeah, so I agree with that. So that's absolutely right. The spaces in the book are trying to cater to very different groups within that, what we like to call the queer coalition, all of which we think have a lot of validity, they have significance, they have beauty and plurality, and we're trying to give a sense of unpick and try and unpick that diversity within the acronym, which we do absolutely use in the title, which is Queer Spaces, an Atlas of LGBTQIA+ places and stories. So I agree with that, but of course, you know, we've got so many spaces, but there was a great limit also in terms of what we can include for all of that diversity. There's sort of been a rather contingent nature to the process of putting it all together, and that's mostly to do with the sorts of connections that we lacked in some places, and we had quite strong networks in other places. But for all that, we've tried to represent as many parts of that acronym as we can, I suppose. And within those letters, there's great diversity as well. And so, although there have been absences, we've tried to use single examples to speak for broader phenomena. But for me, it's, although there's increasingly more about designers, queer designers, it's also for me about architectural historians, you know, and how we can reform what architectural history can do, and how we can, through architectural history, how we can uncover more of those stories. So that's what's kind of in it for me.
I've just found that, you know, without a directly accessible history, it's very difficult to have a sort of sense of confidence and strength when presenting your ideas, which you feel maybe don't have a basis, or people tell you don't have a basis, or are superficial or are silly, but actually they're rooted in a very, very deep and, you know, not millennia, but sort of centuries old series of strands of queer themes. And that's something that we're really hoping to share with the book.
Well, I'm joined by Adam Nathaniel Furman and Joshua Mardell, Tabs, and Christina Riley, and we're talking LGBTQ+ lives. Coming up later today on this, our second CQ Knowledge Day, we're talking disability with campaigner Shani Danda, who incidentally used to work for the RIBA, and Jane Simpson, an accessibility consultant, and Ed Warner, the government champion for accessible design. Earlier, we were discussing socioeconomic diversity with architects Chris Heldry and Philip Watson, GLA Deputy Mayor for Regeneration Jules Pipe, CBE, and Karen Mosley, the Managing Director at HLM Architects. And you can hear it all again on this listen link as we repeat today's live content. We're discussing LGBTQ+ lives with Tabs, Adam Nathaniel Furman, Joshua Mardell, and Christina Riley. And Tabs, you know, just before the Lady Gaga Born This Way, Tabs, Josh and Adam were talking about the Queer Spaces book, you know, the fact that having different spaces, being able to be safe in those has been a really crucial part, and talking about the history of all of those things. You know, you yourself, you've created a night presumably for these reasons. What's the purpose behind it, and what should people in the built environment take away from understanding about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've actually thought very deeply about what kind of space you can run a successful club night in for lesbian, trans and non-binary people. And I think because I've thought about it so much, I do think that's partly why it's been so successful. I have, in the main, run, and I have tried other venues, but the best venue has been the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, which is an interesting space in itself. It is the only queer English heritage listed space in the UK. So it is very historic. It is very, has always been a space, a safe space for queer people. And there is, I think there is a palpable sense of history when you're in that space, for sure. You know, I feel like I can feel the queer people of the past. They're dancing around us on the dance floor, you know, and I think that gives a lot of strength and power to to people accessing that space. The other interesting thing about space is it's a circular building and it's in the round, which has been really interesting to me as someone running a club night, because it means that I can see everything that's going on in the venue, but also everybody else can see everybody else. And I think that's quite interesting when you're talking about lesbian, trans, non-binary people who are not seen in other spaces, who come out to my space to be seen. And everybody can see everybody else, quite literally. And I think that really, really adds to the atmosphere and the sense of togetherness that I achieve at Butch Please. The other thing that's always been really important, obviously, is accessibility. And that is about managing the space. That is about me setting the tone for a welcoming atmosphere, making sure, you know, I wasn't really into doing a kind of Studio 54 vibe. You know, I don't think it's about who gets in and who doesn't, who's cool and who's not. You know, I did all that East London stuff a while ago. But for me, the coolest kind of space is a kind of space which attracts all different kinds of people, different generations of people, and encourages dialogue between those people. And for me, that happens in club spaces. It's not often actually widely talked about. I think it's interesting that you've written this book, because I sometimes struggle with the fact that club spaces and club culture is not really considered like a real thing. It's kind of ephemeral. You know, you go out and it disappears into the ether, and it just lives on in people's hearts, really, and maybe on Instagram. You know, but I think they are serious and important cultural places for queer people. You know, it's often been compared to going to church, you know, and it is places where you can connect with people who experience the world the way you do, and there is nothing more powerful and more important than that.
And so, you know, if I can come to you actually, Adam, on this, that if architects are to consider, okay, how do we build an environment? How do we build a world? How do we build a society that is inclusive and sees these identities? You know, what would you say were the key things that architects needed to bear in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I can't produce a design guide.
Oh, go on.
I've got a very narrow and tiny, you know, sort of personal experience from my perspective. But one thing that I do feel is important, the profession looks at itself and deals with internal diversity. I think that, for me anyway, that's a very, very important thing that's not been properly discussed. The kind of how queerness is allowed to exist within the architectural profession at every level, from education through to practice through to planning, and how conversations about queerness and how it exists, how it's represented, and how it can have some kind of permanent presence in our urban realm beyond ephemeral and the kind of celebratory for maybe one day during a Pride March is something that I think needs to be discussed, because any kind of notion of, or any sort of expression of queerness gets sort of very rapidly squashed out of you, and very rarely goes through education, then through practice, through to planning. Very, very rarely does anything get produced that reifies queerness or shows difference in the physical space of our city. That's just sort of one narrow sort of angle that you know, I guess I've lived and find very important, that's not been dealt with very well.
Christina, in the built environment, and you're in construction mostly, I think that's fair to say. You know, speaking to Adam's point there about, you know, the being in that space and being in that sector and not really seeing or feeling that there's anyone else like you, what's that been like for you?
Well, for 30 years, it's most of those 30 years of my career, it's been a massive challenge. In fact, like the first 22 years of my career, I don't think I saw LGBTQI plus representation at all in the industry. I came out in 2014 to my HR director at the launch of an LGBTQI network at Balfour Beatty. And back then, I think that was the very first time I'd ever seen anything in construction. There were a couple of other networks. I think Arup had a network, but there's pretty much next to nothing. I think maybe Network Rail might have had a network, but you know, when you don't see anything at all, and you know you've lived, you know, for a lot of your life as a trans person, and you have this inability to come out because culturally there's just no visible representation. Often LGBTQI people would have been the butt of sort of banter and jokes. So, you know, I never felt I ever could come out. And so, so as I say, when Balfour Beatty launched the LGBT network, for me, as soon as I saw the advertisement for the launch of the network, I just knew I was going to attend the launch. And that was when I actually decided to come out to as trans to obviously work colleagues, but then my family, my children, friends and colleagues. So, you know, it's life-changing for me. And since then, you know, there have been so many LGBT networks in the construction sector, and Building Equality, I think, has like over 60 organisations within the sector that are actually part of the organisation now. So it's quite reassuring, I think, for a lot of LGBTQI people, but there's still so much to do around, you know, tier 2 contractors. There's probably, you know, pretty much next to nothing in that sort of area of construction. So, you know, we've still got a huge part of the industry that we have to actually help support LGBTQI people.
Josh, when we were talking before we came on air a couple of weeks ago, you talked about how architectural history is a bit of a haven. I mean, you know, in terms of what sense do you feel finding these you know, I suppose psychological spaces within architecture for safety still exists? Can people who are gay be open?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, perhaps I'll also talk about the night space thing a bit as well to link into that. But I think gays, there is something to be said and something needs to be written. There needs to be a lovely sort of book on queer architectural historians. But gays, and I am talking about gays at this moment, and I think it would be a bit more difficult to extend to other parts of, to other constituencies, if you like, seem to have found something of a refuge in architectural history. And I think a part of that was less perhaps a particular style, classicism and Gothic equally, but it was more an interest in the past, somehow going back, you know, to the past to find belonging in a place where they don't feel that perhaps they belonged. And I can mention a name because he was openly gay, Roderick Greydedge, for example, although he said, don't call me gay, call me a pervert. But he was doing this stuff, this sort of historicist stuff, conserving or restoring Puging interiors, designing Victorian pubs in the 1960s, even though he was at the most evangelically modernist school of them all, the Architectural Association. So I wonder if that's a queer journey. Just something perhaps to think about there. But I also, I suppose, wanted to say in terms of what architectural history can bring to this, you were talking about nightclubs. We do include the Royal Vauxhall Tavern. And interestingly, it was listed, I think, in 2015. And as you know, it hosted drag shows. It catered to sort of queer clientele, certainly since the 50s, but it's also strongly associated with the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, which was obviously a terribly queer space for over a century. But most queer spaces don't fulfill the requirements for heritage protection. So we're talking now about, you know, that question we were raising earlier about tangibility and intangibility. The structures of heritage preservation aren't really serving queer heritage very well, certainly not the parameters of statutory protection through listing. They don't tend to recognize LGBTQ plus heritage as a criterion for listing, right? And there was this Prejudice and Pride project offered, staged by the National Trust in 2017 to mark the 50th anniversary of the Sexual Offences Act in 1967. And Michael Hall, who's editor of the Burlington magazine, was going to write a whole book on queering the National Trust. But I think the National Trust actually scrapped the idea. But essentially, he was talking about how it was a misconception that the people who handed over their houses to the organisation were just sort of indigent aristocrats, right? They were also aesthete bachelors who wanted to secure the long-term preservation of the interiors of the collections that they had. So I think, you know, it's important to remember, just I'm sorry if I'm talking too much, but the listing of something is based on nothing else at the moment of other than a building's demonstrable special historic or architectural significance. And that significance part is what's debatable and contested. And it's often very, very difficult to make a case that queer spaces meet such criteria. So sorry, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
well, no, I think it's really important that if we're talking about, you know, and to architects and those in the built environment, that they understand, you know, the breadth and depth of what they need to be thinking about when they're considering this area of LGBTQ plus lives and experience in our society. And Christina, speaking to that point about, safety and spaces, would you say that there is something, well, let me ask you rather than putting words in your mouth, what would you say is the main thing that people need to be thinking about when it comes to this particular area of lived experience?
You're absolutely right, and for me, we talked last week as well, didn't we, about one thing that I often talk about passionately is about linking identity and safety, and within the construction sector and the built environment sector. And safety can be all sorts of things in terms of identities. It can be about the people around us. We LGBTQI people are often can be physically attacked just walking around the built environment. So there's a whole national culture around homophobia, transphobia, lesbophobia, and all the other phobias. So I think it's really important to recognise that. But then there's also personal safety as well, and obviously the construction industry is very much focused on safety as a number one issue. And if you can't be yourself in the workplace, and due to perhaps bullying or inappropriate banter, or a culture where you can't come out, and you're keeping the secrecy of your true self inside you, then for me that really affects who you are as a person. It affects your ability to concentrate, it affects your mental health, it can affect your ability to do your job. And if you're somebody that's at the front line of construction, you're working out on construction sites, you could be working on scaffolding or around big machinery, then if that inappropriate banter, that bullying, that or even that where you're not felt that you can be yourself, and so your mind space is quite focused on, does somebody know that I'm trans? Has somebody, can somebody see some makeup that I may have left on my face, for example? How am I going to be treated? Is somebody going to, take the mickey out of me? And for me, that was how I felt, I suppose, about 8 or 9 years ago before I came out. And that really affected my ability to do my job. It affected my concentration in the workplace. And it also affected my physical health with panic attacks. And for 10 years, I actually suffered 10 years of panic attacks, chronic anxiety in the workplace because I was hiding my true, authentic self. So, these things have real consequences to who we are as LGBT people. And I think that's why it's really important.
We're discussing LGBTQ plus lives with Tabs, Adam Nathaniel Furman, Joshua Mardell and Christina Riley. Just so you know, every day we have My Soundtrack between 5 and 6 p.m, which is a mixture of tunes by a specially chosen guest. And we have the producer of Years and Years, Emery Turkman, tomorrow between 5 and 6. So not one to be missed. We're discussing LGBTQ plus lives with Tabs, the Butch Gardener, Adam Nathaniel Furman and Joshua Mardell and Christina Riley. I mean, Tabs, if I can come to you, who gets to control these spaces, do you think? Because it's all well and good, us having a mixture of people, and, even if we get to this point where it's more inclusive, we have a more diverse and more open acceptance, as Christina was talking about before the tune there, who really controls them?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's something I think about a lot, because there are, to my knowledge, no lesbian owned and run venues in London anymore, as in lots of other cities as well around the world now. And this is a really big issue. It's wonderful to run Butch Please at the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, but it is white, gay, male owned, like almost all the other spaces. And, there is a sense that we kind of infiltrate and transform that space into our own space for those few hours. And then we leave again. And I think that, as I was saying earlier, contributes to this sense that our space is ephemeral. It's just lost. It's just a space in transition. You know, it never really connects into culture and into history. And so I think a lot about how I can infiltrate more spaces, how I can take over these spaces so that we can connect and have space. Because to be honest, people are not handing it to us, and we're unable to have our own spaces. And controlling space is a really important part of being able to create a safe space that welcomes the kind of people you want to come and connect with each other.
Christina, would you say that there is a hierarchy of acceptance within that acronym LGBTQ+?
It's a good question. I think there's a hierarchy in diversity and inclusion anyway, I think. And you know, I think in some ways, you know, I'm not a gay man or woman, you know, but I think a lot of the gay issues were tackled in the workplace maybe 10 years ago. The last 2 years, we've seen greater inclusion around lesbian identities, but I mean, we've still got a long way to go. Bisexual identities, very hardly talked about within the industry. I think there's so much work to be done around that. Trans identities, for the last 3 or 4 years, you know, there's been a lot of work, but I mean, we're seeing quite a big backlash as trans people at the moment, particularly in the British media, but globally as well. You know, massive challenges for transgender identities and queer people. So yeah, we've just got a huge way to go on all of them. And for me, we need to talk about all of these identities equally, and even intersex identities. You know, again, it's another area of diversity and inclusion that is hardly ever talked about. So I think you know, we have just got so much to do in the construction industry. You know, and it goes beyond LGBT in terms of intersectionality with gender and disability and ethnicity.
Adam, if I can ask you, actually, you know, that people listening to this, you know, may well say, well, what does it matter? You know, do you get that a lot? You know, what does it matter that we talk about this in architecture and the built environment? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, all you have to do is look at the Instagram comments whenever I post about the subject. People get quite angry. They say, you know, why does everything have to be about sex? That tends to be the like.
And I guess the point is, it's not about sex, is it?
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of like what you sort of have to explain to people every time. I guess it's what's nice about, you know, the initiative that you're doing here at the RIBA is it frames it within a broad discussion about how important it is in a liberal society for people to understand different perspectives. You know, it helps you if you're ever doing anything with any other people, if you're running a company, if you're creating public space, you just make everything work better. You can be more efficient. You can relate to people better. You can exist in the contemporary employment market better. I think there's a lot of upsides to it from the perspective of maybe the kind of people who'll be listening to this, or people who might be employing or being colleagues with, you know, probably now a small majority of people who do align with all of the identities you'll be speaking about over the calls in the coming days. Yeah, I just think it's highly beneficial for everyone involved.
Josh, if I can ask you to respond, if you can, to Tabs's point about ownership, and how important do you think it is that there's a diversity of ownership of those spaces, you know, within that LGBTQ plus acronym of those spaces, and in the research of your book, what have you discovered about the difference of ownership amongst them?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I mean, I think that I'm not sure if I can speak for specific examples about ownership. It's more that queer people want to own their stories, I suppose, and not, you know, and own their history, and indeed to have a history. It matters that queer people have a history. So I think, you know, that's important. And this idea that it's not all about sex, I mean, that sort of thing comes from within the coalition itself. A case in point in my case is I'm part of an oral history project at the moment for the British Library, interviewing old architectural historians in their 70s and 80s who are in same-sex relationships, and some of those are gay figures, and they give me hell for bringing up sexuality as though it's, you know, it's intrusive. So they're trying to own their own sort of sexual narrative, I suppose, saying that the personal is not relevant to the work. So it can be quite difficult to do. But I think, in short, we need models, and that's the main thing. I think if you were to approach an architect or indeed an architectural educator and say, can you actually count a series of queer spaces on your hand, they would find difficulty in doing that. That hasn't really answered your question, but.
Well, no, I think it's important that we, you know, start to pull apart and start to have these conversations and start to get people thinking about, you know, what these experiences are and what it means for our colleagues, what it means for our organisations, what it means for our firms, what it means for our practices. And Tabs, you know, if you could give the built environment and architecture sector, you know, something to take away about what they should be thinking about, how they should be thinking, maybe something that they needs to challenge. What would that be?
I think quite simply to think about how other people experience space than the kind of people maps that they hang around with. Perhaps, you know, how people experience the world in a way that they can't even imagine, and perhaps they could try and imagine, and then they might get close to be able to create and imagine spaces that are inclusive of different kinds of people.
I might, dare I say, not just imagine, maybe go along to a space that you would recommend to see what that means, what that likes, what that feels like.
Absolutely.
And so, apart from, you know, your own night, you know, where else in the country could people really experience these kinds of nights, or, you know, not even just nights as well, days? Because presumably, you know, you're not just gay during or lesbian during the night. You just
no,
or it's a 24-hour identity.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of lesbian and trans non-binary spaces, I recently, one of the themes I did for the club night was sports teams, and, you know, it turned out actually there were a huge diversity of different sports teams, unbeknownst to me, who took over football pitches and climbing centres and swimming pools to exercise together. That was one thing. That's a daytime thing. You know, I understand for everybody it's not all about going out and drinking. But I mean, in terms of club spaces, there aren't very many. I mean, to my knowledge, there isn't another one in the UK, for example. So of the size of Butch, Please, which is, you know, a shame, actually.
Yeah, in itself is significant. Christina, if you had to give the sector a takeaway, what would it be?
I think for me, diversity and inclusion is such a huge topic, and often we focus on gender and ethnicity, but actually it's all the intersectionalities of all diversity. At the end of the day, we're all different, and you know, we should be, you know, making sure we include intersex people, making sure we speak up for trans people that are really suffering at the moment in terms of the British media, you know, covering bisexual identities, which is hardly talked about, but then also, as I said earlier, you know, bringing in disability, which is, again, is one of the last areas of diversity and inclusion that is really being embraced within the industry in terms of support and visibility. But also, you know, we've got ethnicity. There's so much work to be done around, you know, Black Lives Matter after the George Floyd tragedy last year. You know, there's just so much to do, you know, the gender pay gap as well. You know, women have still got a huge battle. So this is why, you know, the RIBA radio series is so important. And, you know, hopefully that gives people some ideas about, you know, where we need to go moving forward.
Thanks so much to Tabs, Butch Gardener, Adam Nathaniel Furman, Joshua Mardell and Christina Riley. You can hear all of that conversation again by staying tuned to this listening link where it'll be repeated later. Coming up next, we're talking disability with Shani Danda. That's after.
Take a chance. Enter the RIBA Radio Lucky Prize draw.
You know you want to. You know you have to. If you're a RIBA member, you absolutely must join in with our lucky prize draw because we have two fabulous prizes to give away. Win a 2-night stay for you and a friend or lover in one of Mallinson's gorgeous woodland tree houses. I mean, what an amazing, amazing prize that is. And not only are you in with a chance of winning that, you could win tickets to see the Specials live. Their show next July in Dublin. It sold out ages ago. But with our very, very amazing connections, we have managed to secure 2 tickets for our lucky winners, plus a night stay at a hotel of your choice in Dublin, up to the value of £200. The date for the diary is Saturday, the 2nd of July 2022 at Trinity College, Dublin. To enter the draw, go to the RIBA Radio webpage on architecture.com and just fill in the form. You need a magic word, which I'm going to tell you now. That magic word is giraffe. Giraffe. Winners will be announced live during the last RIBA radio broadcast. That's coming up this Friday, unbelievably. It's come around so quick. Plus, each entry will receive a limited edition booklet that folds out in a unique way to reveal a striking and beautifully designed A2 poster with 10 top tips for inclusion, which I've written, but it's beautiful and it's an absolute must for your office wall. So you get that just for entering. So why wouldn't you? Full terms and conditions can be found on architecture.com. Stick with us for the next couple of hours. We're going to be talking disability. It's one of the quietest voices, as far as I'm concerned, in the architecture and built environment. So let's really amplify it. You are listening to RIBA Radio, live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects. With me, Marsha Ramroop, I'm the Director of Inclusion here at the RIBA. We're 14 hours down, 14 hours to go, halfway there. I'm bringing you 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything you do. And it's all rooted in that behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. We've been talking socioeconomics. We've been talking LGBTQ plus lives. Now we're talking disability. It's more to help you with CQ knowledge on RIBA Radio. Coming up today on our second of 2 days talking CQ knowledge. What do you know? What are you thinking about? What do you need to know? We're looking at different lived experiences of the underrepresented in architecture, as well as allyship. So we've been talking socioeconomic diversity. We've been exploring LGBTQ plus lives with Adam Nathaniel Furman and Joshua Mardell and Tabs and Christina Riley. Now we're talking disability. But that's a programme just not to be missed. But that's after today's.
Hey guys, what's up? It's your girl Mandy and you're listening to the 1 to 100 Architecture Podcast, live on RIBA Radio for Diversity and Inclusion. As 7 women of colour, we're about to take you on a journey from R&B to neo-soul, from reggaeton to dancehall, with songs that helped us navigate through our architecture degrees. Tune in this evening from 5 till 6 p.m. and come and vibe with us. It's a wrap.
Oh, yes, that will be a great one. I mean, all of them have been amazing and you can catch up with those. But yeah, absolutely. Catch up with that one between 5 and 6 tonight. Now, Shani Danda is an award-winning disability specialist, listed as one of the UK's most influential disabled people. She's also an actor too, which we'll dig into in a bit. We've known each other in the EDI space for a few years now, EDI, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion. And when I knew I was going to do this radio station, she was one of the first people I called, only to then discover, Shani, you used to work for the RIBA.
Yes, that's right. So it's such a nice it's a nice feeling to be back. I'm back with, in familiar territory. So thank you.
So if I can start by asking you, who is Shani Danda, and what's your relationship with the word disability?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I should start by saying I'm a very proud Brummie uh, who now lives in London, and I work in the space of disability inclusion, and I'm really passionate about representation and intersectionality. I myself am a South Asian disabled woman, so I experience the world through a very unique and intersectional lens. But what that also means is I'm constantly judged, upon my appearance, and that might be a consequence of, my condition, my race, my gender, or it might be, some of them or all of them. I guess I don't really know. And yeah, that's so I'm working the space of inclusion, helping businesses and brands to be more inclusive and just make the world a bit fairer to live in.
So how did you come to work at the RIBA, and what's been your involvement with architecture?
Okay, so I went to uni and did a degree in event and venue management. Now, I was always one of these kids who never knew what she wanted to do when she was older, and I always envied the other kids that always knew what they wanted to do. And that was because I went to a special needs primary school because of the condition that I was born in. And a lot of my childhood was really focused on my health. I really didn't have time to think about what my adult life would look like. So never in a million years did I ever think I'd be going off to uni. But worked hard, and I just chose a subject that I enjoyed. And I guess what I didn't realise, Marsha, choosing a career in event management was so aligned to my skill set. So I have a short stature. I'm 3'10" in height. I'm about the height of a 4-year-old. And my whole life has been lived through this lens of always thinking outside of the box, always thinking creatively, whether that's how I'm going to reach my kitchen cupboards, to how I'm going to travel, to how I'm going to buy and wear clothes, the simple things that I guess many of us take for granted. And that's what you need to do when you're an event manager. You need to be creative, resourceful, resilient. You need to go above and beyond and be really creative. So that's how I came to work at RIBA. I joined as I think it was the title, I think was like events and professional development coordinator. So I used to organise CPD, the awards events, public programs, a whole mixture of stuff, as well as working on national programs as well. And really loved it. I really, really loved it.
So coming now to your involvement in, disability activism, for want of a better phrase, and we look at, I look across the architecture sector, and it became really clear to me really early on how quiet the disability voice is in the architecture sector. I mean, I shared a stat earlier about only 1% of architects have declared as being having a disability, when it makes up 18 to 20% of the actual UK population. So really disproportionately quiet. But we don't really have, or there's a sense that we don't have people with disabilities coming into the profession. That doesn't seem that's quite right. And meanwhile, there's an unemployment crisis facing disabled people. So what do you think's going on there? I mean, what's your experience of having a disability and not being able to find work when people appear to be crying out for good people?
I think it's a really sad state of affairs, isn't it, if the data's saying that? But I think we have to look, we definitely have to scratch the surface there. So it's no surprise that disabled people are finding it very tough to get employment. I call it a crisis, if I'm being completely honest, and especially when 25% of UK employers are telling us that they're less likely to employ someone with a disability, and then 60% are concerned whether a disabled person could do the job. Is it any surprise that we're not seeing disabled people across many different industries and sectors? And if we just look at architecture, for example, are disabled people going to be encouraged to take that up as a profession if they don't see disabled people succeeding in this industry? Are disabled people even going to consider it as an opportunity if workplaces and everything that involves, being an architect isn't going to be accessible to them? But also, I think we should really talk about how do we actually define disability and what does that actually mean? So the easiest way to understand it, I think, is to really break it down, strip it right back. And essentially, people are born with or acquire conditions or impairments, and disability is an experience. So you are not born disabled. Disability is something that you experience when you're faced with a barrier or a bias. So despite the fact that I was born with a condition and I have a short stature, it doesn't disable me 24/7. It's when I'm faced with things that aren't accessible to me, or bias in my ability, for example, and just to help to bring that to life. At the age of 16, I had applied for over 100 jobs, and I didn't hear anything back. And it wasn't until I removed that one sentence from my covering letter which said, "I've got a condition, I don't need any adjustments." And I thought I was doing the right thing. I was acknowledging the fact that I've got a condition. It's very visible. I can't hide it, nor do I want to hide it. I thought, hang on, let me be the person to remove all the awkwardness here, because, when I get called in for an interview, that the interviewer might feel awkward. So I was doing it for the other person more so than me. And so at the age of 16, I had to learn a very harsh life lesson. So that's what we mean when we talk about disability, and that 1% stat, it just can't be right, because 1 in 5 of us in the UK population live with a condition or an impairment. That's 22% of the overall population. So I think maybe if we ask the question a little bit differently, or if people had a broader understanding of disability, a more holistic view, rather than just looking at it from a medical perspective, we would probably see an increase in those stats.
And that experience that you talked of there about, applying for jobs, I was speaking to a deaf architect who told me that this was exactly his experience, where, he was declaring, I'm deaf. And it's when he removed that information that he got invited for interview. And then when he went for interview, then he wasn't given the opportunities because they said, oh, you didn't declare that you were deaf, which is, in itself, illegal, probably, in terms of that discrimination. But it's real and it's happening now. So even though this happened to you, a few years ago, and probably still would if you weren't in the position that you were in, it's happening now in architecture, in the built environment, because of this prejudice around the word, and people feel that they can't explain. But there's no sense. I mean, sometimes people saying that they have or experiencing disability is simply just to declare it, not because it's going to impact on their ability necessarily to do any work. So, what do employers need to think about when they are faced with someone who's declaring or being upfront about, I have a disability here? What do they need to deal with there?
I think that first things first, we need to acknowledge the fact that 20% of the working population are disabled, and 8 out of 10 disabled people acquire their disability during their working life. So the chances are that disability is an issue that we are all going to come across, in our workplaces, or whether we experience it ourselves. So we can't keep being awkward about it. And I really find this so strange. I live with my condition. It inconveniences me, but everybody else feels awkward about it around me. That doesn't make sense. It's not for you to feel awkward about. okay, I know we don't have amazing disability representation on our screens, in our books, in our films. Like, we are still living in a time where non-disabled actors play disabled characters, and that's seen as okay. I get it, but I still don't think that's enough of a reason for everyone to just feel so awkward. And, you know, the disability charity Scope have actually done research on this, and 2/3 of Brits have actively avoided a conversation with a disabled person. So first things first, I would say, get over your own awkwardness, get over that fear of, I might say the wrong thing, I don't know how to act. Like, as a disabled person, you are not going to be the first person that we encounter that is going to be like that. But you also need to consider that you are massively overlooking a huge pool of talent. And, you know, let's talk about the moral fact here as well. Like, for many of us, having a job is something that is personally fulfilling, you know, socially, economically, and professionally. And disabled people face many unavoidable extra costs. And then let's add into that, disabled people are twice as likely to be unemployed. When applying for jobs, only half of applications result in an interview, and nearly half of everyone that lives in poverty in the UK is disabled or lives with a disabled family member. Disabled people need to work just as much as everybody else. Probably, I would argue, even more with all these extra costs that we face, and that, you know, it's not a small amount. It's £583 a month. So I just think that, especially, you know, now with the impact of COVID, which means disabled people and carers are at least twice as likely to face redundancy than the rest of the working population. Employers need to wake up to this fact. They need to wake up to the fact that they are massively overlooking a huge pool of talent. And especially in this space of architecture, why wouldn't you work with and want the skills and knowledge and lived experience of disabled people to design much more accessible places? And I just want to make a point, really, like, every space that I occupy, even my own home, it's not accessible. It makes life so much more harder. It constantly puts me at a disadvantage. It gives me so much more, disadvantage than it does to other people. Like, whether that's the flat that I pay a stupid amount of rent for to live in London, whether that's a workplace. And architects are the creators of these spaces, you know, where we all work, live, play, socialize. So for me, I just can't see why people aren't joining the dots.
Well, I'm speaking to Shani, Danda, about disability and some of the things that we need to think about as part of our CQ knowledge when considering disability. I feel like I need to apologise to my RIBA colleagues here, where we're broadcasting from at 66 Portland Place, because I did just run to the loo again. As you know, I'm sitting here for 4 hours and drinking lots of water, having my tea, and I give myself 2 minutes to run down to the toilet, and that's, you know, obviously to get down there, do what I need to do, wash my hands, dry my hands. And so I do actually undo my trousers as I'm halfway down the stairs. So apologies to anyone who just caught me doing that. That's the reality of the situation here. Coming up later on this, our second CQ Knowledge Day, we're going to continue to talk about disability alongside Shani, Danda. We're going to have Jane Simpson, the accessibility consultant and architect, and Ed Warner, government champion for accessible design. We're now on day 4 of broadcasting, so there's 3 days of stuff to catch up with. Day 1, we had an overview of CQ, unconscious bias and inclusion in the profession. Day 2, we looked at CQ drive, so motivation, fear, discomfort and data. And Shani was just talking about some of that getting over the fear factor, and we'll talk about that again in a second. Yesterday, we had women and race, so head over to the RIBA YouTube channel for more on that. We are speaking to Shani, Danda, the award-winning disability disability specialist and former RIBA staff member, about the issues and concerns around disability. And you were speaking, you know, quite openly there about how architects have the power to be able to change spaces, to make them more accessible for people with disabilities. So why wouldn't we have more of that voice in the profession? But there is this fear factor. I mean, how would you advise architects got over that fear? Because that is really what's quite a huge element of thinking they have to do something, they have to make some changes. I don't know. How do they get over it?
I think you sort of hit the nail on the head there. In addition to having architects having the power, they also have the responsibility. And look, if something's new or different to you, yes, you know, at first it might feel a little bit awkward. But what we need to do is just look at disability as another characteristic. So for me, just like I have brown hair, I also live with a condition. So as much as as a big thing you might think it is, actually for the population of people that live with conditions and impairments, like it's just another, you know, feature. It's just another characteristic that make us who we are. So what I would say is there's never been a better time to be disabled. And people usually give me a puzzled look when I say that. But what I mean by that is, I feel like, again, like back when we had London 2012 and the Paralympics, I feel like disability is having a bit of a moment. You know, we have got amazing programs on TV, amazing comedians. I absolutely love Rosie Jones. I'm not saying disability representation is there. It's woefully lacking, but it's so much better than what it was. So you need to take it upon yourself to learn about disability, learn about the lives of disabled people and the reality of navigating a world that isn't designed for you. And I also want to say that, you know, disability is the largest diversity strand. It's the largest minority group in the world, and anyone can be part of it overnight. Because if we, you know, look at some of the other diversity strands, you can't change your race, your ethnicity, your age, even though probably some of us might want to change our age. You know, you've got to go through a process to change your gender. So a good way of looking at this is that, you know, we are all pre-disabled. That might be permanently, temporarily, or situational. And another way of looking at this is that essentially all of us as human beings, we all have abilities and limits to those abilities. So I think the best place would be starting from education, learning about that, and learning about disability from a much more holistic perspective instead of just focusing on the medical aspects of it.
One of the things that I like to do here is, and actually it is in the 10 top tips on the poster that you can receive if you fill in the form and enter the prize draw, by the way. Who are your friends? Asking yourself, who are your friends? Do you know people with disabilities? And when you think about it, I'm sure you do. And so when you think about that, think about, well, why wouldn't I employ someone like this friend of mine who has this particular condition, or, you know, this family member who goes through this particular process or has this need? And so given that 1 in 5 of us have got some condition that means that we experience disability, it shouldn't be that difficult to find those voices, surround yourself with them and listen to those disability voices, so that, you know, you can start to inform yourself and start to take those steps to be more cognizant of what it requires. So when we think about, you know, this environment in which we're in, and the fact that we need architects in the built environment to be listen and also act on those voices that have a disability experience, what sort of measures do we want people to put in place in order to track their change around this?
It's a great question, Marsha. I think I want to start by saying that as of all of as a general rule, when you solve problems for disabled people, they are solutions that you can extend to many other groups and communities as well. So it's only in, your own best interest. So to help you really get started on that journey, you need to think differently. So you need to celebrate difference and capture the importance of diversity in your workplace behaviours and values. And that's also about promoting accessibility and inclusion in the design of your services, processes and systems and work environment. And I think this is the starting point for making the work environment inclusive for everybody. And then, of course, there's so much awkwardness about disability. We need to start talking openly, because changing culture starts with encouraging and supporting your employees to be open when it comes to discussing their impairment or condition. Because what you don't want as an employer is a group of your workforce masking themselves, hiding the fact that they might be living with a condition. Surely you would want them to be set up for success. You would want them to have the right support, the right equipment, and you would want your employees to stop focusing on not being their true authentic selves and just focus on being productive in their role. But that's not gonna happen. People aren't going to feel safe to share this information, to confide in certain people in the workplace if let's say there's no visibility of diversity or inclusion in your organization, if you've never had a conversation on disability. There are so many awareness days. I'm not saying you've all got to share your own personal stories. It's a very big thing to do, but it's there's so many ways in which you could do it. But I think championing everyday inclusion and disability would really help. And then a couple of other points. I think you need to be able to lead confidently as well, because clear leadership and accountability for disability is really important for it to get on your agenda and for it to maintain focus. And also then you'll be helping to make sure that the people that are applying for jobs with you are getting the right support, because it's all well and good having disabled people come through the door and then join your organisation, but it's not always easy for disabled people to stay in a job as well, especially if things like processes change, line managers change. All of that stuff can really impact on your experience. And lastly, I just want to say you also need to know how you all measure up, because transforming your approach to disability isn't going to change overnight. We are talking about culture change here. So I encourage all, organisations, irrespective of what size you are, to find ways to build trust, create a dialogue and track your progress, because that's what's going to help you keep focused and encourage momentum.
So, you've made the point about what does having clear leadership and accountability. What does clear leadership and accountability look like to you?
To me, that would look like appointing a senior champion or somebody from your senior leadership team to be accountable, and for them to take the responsibility of disability inclusion, because once it's there at the senior level, it stays on that high level agenda, then there's less risk of it just slipping down the priority list. So to me, that's what that looks like. But also, and I guess stepping away from disability specifically, but more inclusion lens focus, we need to learn inclusive behaviours off one another. Sometimes we need to be very explicit about what inclusive behaviour looks like, because we might not have had good examples of that. And I think that should come from obviously everybody, but must be behaviours that your senior leadership teams have, or your senior champion. So for me, that's what I would be looking at doing.
And you talked about building trust as well. I mean, that 1% of the 68 of registered architects with the ARB declaring that they have lived experience of disability, there may be something there about how people feel that they can't say out of those who do declare their data. So what needs to change for current architects to feel that they can be upfront if they've got an experience of disability?
This is a really it's a broad area, really. It's so complex. So essentially what we're asking people to do by sharing their information is label themselves. And as we know, disability is a label and not everybody wants to be associated with that label. If you had met the 20-year-old version of me, I wanted nothing to do with disability until I learned about the social model of disability, which talks about, we live in a disabling world, and it's not my condition that disables me, it's the world around me and society. So what we have to recognize is that everybody is on a different, everybody's on a journey when it comes to, managing your condition or your impairment. And everyone's at a different stage of that journey. And if I'm being truthfully honest, I don't think a lot of disabled people have disability pride. It's tough. It's really tough being a disabled person. It's tough. Not getting the support that you need. It's tough seeing that things you probably asked for pre-pandemic were just given to everybody overnight because it suited the majority. Take, for example, remote or flexible working. I think disabled people were so frustrated at the fact that things that we've been asking for many years, and we've always told no, and for some reason that's a reason they couldn't work, then suddenly, because it suited the majority and what was deemed as the majority, it was, these changes happened very quickly in society. So there's what I'm saying is there's a lot to consider here. I would look at actually how you ask the question and what you do with that information as well, because are you really interested as an employer about what people's medical history is? Because you shouldn't be. What you should be focusing on is what are the barriers that you're experiencing from you doing your role, and how can we remove them? And I think that's why many approaches to disability inclusion fail, because I think people feel that they need to be an expert in certain conditions and impairments. Obviously, it's great to have some basic knowledge, but we have medical professionals for that. There's a time and place that, we deal with that side of that stuff. But when we're in workplaces, we just need to work with open-minded employers and leaders to help us understand how we can remove the barriers that are getting in our way just from getting on in our roles. So
we're speaking to Shani Danda, the award-winning disability specialist. Coming up tomorrow, we have our first day talking CQ strategy, planning, checking and awareness. So as part of planning, we're going to use our knowledge well. We'll be discussing inclusive recruitment, architectural education, and that's going to be with the Future Architects Front. Assumptions made about architecture outside of London and planning policy around the menopause. Earlier, we were discussing socioeconomic diversity with the architects Chris Hildry and Philip Watson, the GLA Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills, Jules Pipe, and Karen Mosley, the Managing Director at HLM Architects. And you can hear all of that again on this listen link as we repeat today's live content. We're talking to Shani Danda, the award-winning disability specialist and former RIBA staff member, about the issues and concerns around disability as part of our CQ knowledge. And you made a really, really powerful point there before we went to a Beautiful by Christina Aguilera about how overnight, we were able to put in accommodations that people have been asking for forever. The changes, the adaptations, if they're needed, they're not difficult really, are they?
No, and I think there's a really big misconception that adjustments or any sort of flexibility that people might need, maybe because of a disability, is really costly, it's difficult, you've got to redesign a whole building. And you know what, that's not the case at all. And many of the organisations that I've worked with, supporting them with disability inclusion, I have to say the majority of the adjustments or flexibility, it's never costed it's not cost anything. It's mainly been the flexibility side of stuff, you know. So yeah, I think there's so many different myths that we have as well when we think about employing disabled people. So yeah.
What other myths are there?
So there's been a lot of research, you know, carried out around the topic of disability and employment over the years, and it's concluded in the fact that disabled people overall are reliable because we take fewer days off, we take less sick leave, and we stay in jobs longer than other workers. We are productive once in the right position and with the correct support. We perform as well or better as other employees. And we're affordable because recruitment costs are lower due to less turnover. And as I said, you know, the majority of adjustments are low cost or cost nothing at all. And we're safe because we're no more likely to be injured at work than any other employee. And finally, we're good for business because we're reflecting the customers and the communities that we serve. And people just prefer to work for more inclusive organisations. And I think this really highlights the point that, you know, when we think of disability, the first thing that pops into many people's mind is ramps and wheelchairs. Well, actually, out of the 14 million disabled people that we have in the UK, 70% live with non-visible conditions or impairments, and only 1.2 million disabled people are wheelchair users. It's still a significant amount, but even the symbol that we have to represent disability, which is a wheelchair user, even that isn't, you know, overly representative of this, you know, hugely diverse community.
And so, you know, architects, as we know, quite crucial, as in you've made the point, in trying to design a world, design spaces, and ensure not only architects as well, but the rest of the built environment that we can be inclusive as possible. That point that you make about having that voice within your workplace, within your organization, within your firm, can be the difference between being inclusive in what you do as well, the products and services of architecture, you know, and not doing that. Isn't that the case, Shani?
Absolutely. And I think you can only reach that point when you've got that lived experience around you and you're able to tap into that community. You know, if you perhaps don't have disabled people in your practice, go out and speak to them. You do a focus group to get your things tested, and you know, go and speak to the communities that you're going to be serving, and quite often it is going to be disabled people.
Now, you've been involved in something very particular, the Disability Employment Charter that's gone to government. Can you explain a little bit more about that? What is that, and what do you hope to achieve with that?
Sure. So you might know that early this year, the government announced their long-awaited National Disability Strategy, and it was a bit lacklustre to say the least. You know, we were promised this big plan with a solid action plan, but because, you know, the disability employment crisis is only getting bigger and bigger, and it's not really improving. Disabled people, as long as disability charities and the organisations have come together now and put together this charter to help lobby the government to make this a mandatory requirement. So it's essentially a call for the government to act, and it proposes a set of vital measures that if they're implemented in a certain manner, that they would substantially shift the dial on disability employment. And I really do urge everybody to go and look it up, and you know, if you feel you're able to support the charter, put your name against it as an organisation. But another thing is it's a really good starting point. It's brilliant insight for any business out there on what action they can take straight away.
What does the charter say then?
So there's 9 points to the charter, and I think for me the most important one is about employment and pay gap reporting. So you may or may not be aware that the disability pay gap is so wide that disabled people effectively work 2 months of the year for free. Now, I don't know many people that would voluntarily work 2 months of the year for free. And then when you layer further characteristics on top of that, let's say, you know, ethnicity and gender, the gap just gets even wider and wider and wider. So the Charter wants the government to require all employers with over 250 employees to publish data annually on the number of disabled people they employ, as well as the disability pay gap. And there's other things in the Charter as well, such as workplace adjustments, you know, working with disabled people and their representatives. And again, if you don't know, there's something called Access to Work, which is a discretionary government grant, which helps disabled people get in and stay into work. It's absolutely open to everybody. I think it's the government's best kept secret. If you don't know about it, if there's one thing you take away from this conversation, please go and look up Access to Work, whether you're an employer or a disabled person, and go and tell your disabled friends about it as well. Like, it's a brilliant scheme.
What does it
do?
it's
a 9-point action plan essentially.
What does the Access to Work scheme do, if I can ask that?
Yeah, so Access to Work, it can help sort of facilitate things like any adjustments that are needed and the cost of it. So that, you know, that might be, so for me, for example, when I worked at RIBA, I used Access to Work, and they provided me with a bespoke chair, a footstool, and a keyboard. So they really help. It's personalised support, and it tailors it, you know, the support to every different individual's need, and it just takes a bit of the pressure off the employers as well. So really, there is no excuses there. You've got government support there to get disabled people in, whether that's, you know, for interview or for jobs. That there's really no excuse.
So what other places can people go to look to find the kind of resources and support that they need as an organisation to take the actions that you would recommend?
That's a great question. So there are several key organisations and networks that can help you get going and support you wherever you might be on your disability inclusion journey. The first one I want to call out is by scope, and the community is called Work With Me. And that's a network of businesses that support each other in becoming more inclusive for disabled people. It's free to join and to access the library of resources. The next one is Even Break, and that's a specialist job site that connects disabled job seekers with disability-friendly and inclusive employers. There's also something called the Disability Confidence Scheme. That's a government scheme, and that helps employers make the most of the opportunities provided by employing disabled people. And what it means is disabled people have a list of all the organisations in the UK that are disability confident employers. Now, this is something that I personally look for if I was ever applying for work. So it's something that you should be part of. It also gives you an action plan of things to do. And also, you know, I just mentioned Access to Work. And, you know, finally, you can contact me and see how I might be able to help you as well, because I do understand the industry too.
Well, thanks so much to Shani Danda. She's staying with us as we have more of a deep dive into these issues in the next hour, alongside Jane Simpson, the accessibility consultant and architect, and Ed Warner, who does, amongst other things, government champion for accessible design. You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, and we are going to talk the lucky prize draw. But I'm not alone. I've got the voice, one of the other voices of the Lucky Prize Draw, Carolinda Booth, one of the she is the executive producer of RIBA Radio. Carolinda, you have been instrumental in getting these prizes together. Tell me about the 2-night stay.
Well, hello, Marsha. What an amazing time we're having here in Portland Place in the fabulous bookshop. These prizes, well, they're fabulous, and I want to enter it myself, except we're not allowed, are we?
No, we're not.
Well, the first prize we have on offer here, and you must watch out for the special word that Marsha's going to give away a bit later. That's going to be your ticket. You can win a 2-night stay for you and a friend or a lover. Let's do that again. For you and a friend or a lover in one of Mallinson's gorgeous woodland tree houses. Uniquely designed, these funky luxury retreats include fabulous things for a very pampering stay, like hot tubs. What else have they got, Marsha?
Saunas.
And what can you sit by a stream with or underneath?
A cargo net daybed. We're doing a fab job of this. We can also win tickets to see the specials.
Oh, I haven't finished the wood burning stove if it's chilly.
Right, yeah, love away.
So it doesn't matter if it's a bit cold outside or it's in the autumn. It'd be quite nice, wouldn't it? A wood burning stove if it's chilly.
It would.
The perfect place to escape and get away from it all. Have we got time to talk about the specials?
Very quickly, yeah.
Okay, and you've got to see the specials. I actually did see them in concert a few months ago. It was amazing. You forget how many hits the specials have had, actually. Every song you go, oh, I remember that one. And it's sold out. But because of our fantastic connections here at RIBA Radio, we've managed to score a couple of tickets for Dublin, which is going to be absolutely amazing. You'll be squashed up, so don't wear anything too tight.
Well, to enter the draw, go to the RIBA Radio webpage on architecture.com, fill in the form, and the magic word you need is giraffe. Giraffe.
RIBA Radio with Marsha Ramroop.
You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects, with me, Marsha Ramroop. I'm the Director of Inclusion here. We're bringing you 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything you do, and it's all rooted in the behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. Quite deliberately today on this panel about disability, alongside Shani, I have Jane Simpson and Ed Warner, who they themselves don't have lived experience of disability, but are demonstrating real coalition and putting into action their power to help amplify the disability voice in the sector. We, of course, have many people with lived experience of disability across output, but I made this decision to make a specific point about how quiet the disability voice is in the profession, and it's beholden upon all of us to support and concern ourselves with how much we're thinking about disability in the sector, be it how we attract and educate those with lived experience of disability and or neurodivergence, how we treat and progress those in our practices and organisations, how we create the products and services we offer, and how we engage our external stakeholders with disabilities and neurodivergence. I'll get them to explain how they forged their path of allyship and coalition after
Unsung Hero.
Hi, my name is Luisa and I'm from Portugal. My unsung hero is Dr. Susie Ridout. Dr. Susie Ridout was very important to bring about more inclusivity and knowledge of neurodiversity in the faculty I was studying at for my Part 2 Masters. She lectured the faculty on neurodiversity and was my mentor during the time when I was having issues formulating a brief for myself. She helped me in many ways, and even though she's not an architect, she helped me advance with my final project. When I met her in person, I became very emotional. For the first time, a member of the faculty understood the complexities of our shared social environment as I was trying to understand them and fitting in. Neurodiversity is very important when looking at a shared space of work, because negotiations have to occur between everybody's particular sensory and one could say cultural profiles. Dr. Susie understands this intrinsically, and we consulted with her in the design of the spaces in the faculty. I would like to take this opportunity to thank her for her incredible insights into the themes and structures surrounding cultural and neurodiversity in the educational environment, which sometimes, and without mediators like her, can be very difficult to share and to navigate. If Dr. Susie was here in front of me, I would tell her that thanks to her insights and teachings, I have found a better informed way to navigate my environment, and that I grew enormously from my experience with having her as a mentor. Susie's teachings impact on my life are daily, and I learned to listen to more people's differences and see what we can gain from these. Having her as a mentor in my final year really prepared me for my current challenges, and the lessons I learned will be with me for the rest of my life.
And we'll be hearing from Dr. Susie Ridout on our panel about inclusive recruitment tomorrow morning. So let's talk disability in architecture. And just like I mentioned, we still have with us Shani Danda. I also have Jane Simpson, who's on the Architects for Change Committee here at the RIBA, and Ed Warner, CEO of Motion Spot and the Government Champion for Accessible Design and Spaces and Products. Jane, if I can start by asking you, can you describe yourself and what's your relationship with the word disability?
Okay, that's interesting because I just had to knock on the window, get my husband to turn off the power hose, which he was suddenly decided to do. Yeah, I got involved in Access South 3 decades ago when I first qualified as an architect. And I was kind of thrown into it. I did disabled facilities grants, and some of my best friends from that time. And I learned so much from those people individually. And it just became a career for me, and I absolutely adore it. And I know Ed, I know Shana, and it's a huge world out there, and we just need people to actually take it on board. We design for everybody. That's my approach, and I help RIBA out a lot with regs and standards groups and other areas. So it's a huge market out there for people to please come, help, join in. And I think the more architects that take this on board, the better the whole society will be.
And Ed, if I can ask you to describe yourself, and what's your relationship with this word, disability?
Hello, Marsha. Lovely to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I suppose my relationship with disability started 10 years ago now, after I started the accessible design business Motion Spot, inspired by an old school friend and co-founder, James Taylor, who sadly suffered a spinal cord injury in a diving accident aged 25. He returned to his flat in Battersea, South London, to find it looking more like a care home than his own home, full of all the products that are often so synonymous with disability and ageing. And as a friend at the time, I said, let me try and help you find some decent products that make your home feel like a home as opposed to a hospital. So that's what first opened my eyes to disability. And I realised that, to Jane's point, there weren't enough people looking at this area and blending function with form. So that was my first involvement with it.
Shani, if I can ask you, how important is representation? Because, one of the things, obviously you're doing this acting now as well, and highlighting, presumably to highlight this idea of representation, visible representation, to help start to instill a little bit more of that idea of, this is anybody, this is everybody, this could be any one of us. Oh, we can't hear Shani. Shani, I'm afraid we can't hear you. So if you can make sure that your mic is on.
Sorry.
That's, you know what, we're doing really well. We're halfway through RIBA Radio. That's the first time that's happened. So Shani, you're making the point about representation.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the first thought when we think about disability is all ramps and wheelchairs. But I guess growing up, I had no disability representation, and I mean that at his broadest sense of disability, but then delving a little bit deeper into diverse representation of disability. And I think what struck me the most now as an adult is I've learned that there are certain communities, especially ethnic minority communities and South Asian communities, that are more predisposed to conditions and impairments, therefore have higher rates of disability. But I never see these people anywhere. So I guess from a young age, I always knew I wanted to become part of the change that I wanted to see. And I guess these opportunities to be on screen, which I'm enjoying right now, is one avenue. But I think representation really, really is important. And from a young age, I regularly go past children, whether I'm in the supermarket or in a shopping centre, And they're so curious. And look, I've got a short stature. I'm usually about the same height as the child that's pointing me out and saying, oh, look, mummy, there's a small lady. And I don't find that offensive in the slightest, but what I do find really awkward is the parent will tell the child off, the parent will avoid having that confrontation, and I'm just like, that's not the way to deal with it at all. Like, if anything, use it as an opportunity to talk about diversity and how we're all, different shapes and sizes and colours.
Yeah, I think that's really important. A really clear story I remember a few years ago talking to colleagues about how, it's always in the supermarket, isn't it? In the supermarkets, that she, her daughter saw someone who I think was in a wheelchair, and and the child pointed out and said, "Oh, mummy, why is that man in a wheelchair?" And she said, "Well, I don't know, go and ask him," which I think is a really refreshing, and then the person in the wheelchair did then say to my friend, thank you, because so often it's like, oh, told off, or don't look, don't stare. Well, actually engage in the conversation is definitely one of the things to do. And that idea of representation, Jane, you've been in this space now for quite some time. Sorry, I don't mean Jane, you've been around forever. But in your experience, how have you tried to amplify that disability voice in the profession?
I think in everything I do, to be quite honest with you, it's what I try to get architects to understand. It's not just another design process. It's just about understanding how things work and looking at it. And there's this sort of impression that it's social work. It's not social work. We're all individuals. I did a program recently for the radio where the premise of the question was, what if we were all disabled? Well, we all are to some extent. So what we need to think about is, how do we design, not for the golden man, not for the golden section, but for that full diversity. And you're never going to get what I would classify as a completely accessible building, because nothing's ever accessible to everybody. What we need to ensure is that we've got inclusive design that welcomes and brings everybody into it. And I think I'll give you a little instance. I once went round an energy for waste plant, would you believe? And I looked round and the tonal contrast was spot on. And the contractor went, I worked with you on a school in Rotherham. And basically, he'd learned from me, he'd remembered it. And I think that's what I try to do in my work, is help people and teach people what you need to think about and how you need to move forward.
Ed, you have this desire, if you like, to change, to encourage a culture of change across the industry and make sure that spaces and products are better. Tell me a bit more about your drive to be this ally and to have this coalition with those with disabilities.
I think that drive comes from both my job professionally, but also my involvement at government level with design of accessible products and spaces. So professionally with Motion Spot, I saw in the very early days that as Jane said, the offer on the market just wasn't good enough for disabled people, and I was driven to want to see a change for my friend James, and that then led on to wanting to see change across other people's homes, but also commercial spaces, whether they be workplaces, retirement villages, or hotels. Certainly, most recently, in my role as government sector champion for design of accessible products and spaces, I've been driven to really want to generate change in this space, and really my vision in that perspective has been to try and encourage businesses to design more inclusively and to build more accessible spaces within their built environment, but also to engage and involve more disabled people in the design process from the outset. Still, not enough people are involved in the design of accessible products. And even if they are involved, they tend to just be asked as part of a focus group at the start of the design process. And for me, that just doesn't wash. In order to get truly inclusive products and spaces, there has to be engagement right the way through that design process.
We're broadcasting live from 66 Portland Place here at the bookshop, and if you hear noises and things going on, they're obviously still an open bookshop, so just in case you're wondering what's going on. Jane, if I can ask you, why does it appear to be so difficult? Why does it appear to be that the disability voice just isn't loud enough in the sector, and what's stopping the sector from being better around this point?
I think in many ways it's actually not the education, although I think there could be improvements in education of architects in particular, because I find students far more accepting and more interested and wanting to know and wanting to learn. I think it goes back to the sort of issues you've probably been talking about all week, about the control of the industry is very much white, middle class, male led. And quite often I find it's easier to deal with the architects on the shop floor. And I also think there is this feeling that it's difficult for them and that it's going to cost money. And as I always say, the sooner you think about it, the cheaper it is, not only in monetary terms, but also in the architect's redraw. And as soon as you start saying that to them, they start to think, oh, okay, I can save myself some time. And again, going back to the point that was made before, majority of people are not born with a disability, they develop one. And it happened to my husband when he was, how old was he? 43, I think he was, something like that. And you know, it will come to all of us. And if people start to understand that, it actually starts to make them think about their own environment and how it would affect them. 1 in 4 people has a very close family member or friend who has a disability. Just need to get that across. And I think we should use this moment to actually push the industry to start to consider it. And I think it's sometimes they're very scared to ask the questions, very scared. I mean, I once got accused of using the medical model because I was describing the implications of some disabilities. But unfortunately, unless designers understand what the limitations are, they can't design the barriers out. So we've got to somehow get a link between the medical and social model and come up with a way that designers can understand what they need to do. And that's what designers are good at. Give them the criteria and they should be able to deal with it.
I'm with Shani, Danda, Jane Simpson and Ed Warner talking about disability in architecture. Coming up tomorrow, we have our first day talking CQ strategy, planning, checking and awareness. So as part of planning, using your knowledge well, we'll be discussing inclusive recruitment, architectural education with the Future Architects Front, assumptions made about architecture outside of London and planning policy around the menopause. Earlier, I was joined by Adam Nathaniel Furman and Joshua Mardell, Tabs and Christina Riley, and we talked about LGBTQ plus lives, an amazing, really insightful conversation about those lived experiences. You'll do well to catch up with the subtitle video as soon as we can accurately and accessibly, and hopefully within 24 hours, get that up on RIBA's YouTube channel. I'm with Shani, Danda, Jane Simpson and Ed Warner, and we're talking about disability in architecture. And just before we went to that really beautiful track, 1,000 Years by Christina Perry, Jane, you made this point about the social model and the medical model of disability. And Shani, if you could explain again a little bit, what is that social model of disability? What does that mean?
Sure. So the social model of disability is a way of viewing the world developed by disabled people. And the model says that that people are disabled by barriers in society, not by their impairment or their difference. And, you know, barriers can be physical, like not having access to certain buildings, for example, or they can be caused by people's attitudes to difference, like assuming disabled people can't do certain things. And why I love the social model is because it helps us recognise the barriers that make life harder for disabled people, and by removing the barriers, that's what helps to create, you know, equality and equity, and it offers disabled people more independence, control and choice.
And Jane, you talked about the medical model. So what is that? What does that mean?
I mean, if you go back to the 1970s with the Chronically Sick and Ill and Disabled People's Act, which kind of sums it up completely, it's basically saying that it's the disabled person's fault that they can't get into somewhere, and that's just not the case at all. I mean, we're very lucky in the UK in many ways because we have British standards. We have some really, really useful guidance documents. They don't go far enough, but again, it's not about the disabled person not being able to get in. It's about designers not thinking effectively and designing so that it enables as many people as possible to get into places with equity. And I think the equity is the most important thing. It's not just about getting through the front door, it's about how you get through that front door.
Yes, and just to be clear, the difference between equity and equality suggests that everyone should be given the same, which is fine if everybody is at the same start point. But of course, that isn't always the case. And so equity speaks to addressing needs and redressing historical imbalance. Ed, when you do your role in this government advisor role, what are you trying to do and achieve with that?
So just following on from what Jane and Shani have said, it's really around the levelling up piece, giving people the equity to be able to access products and services and spaces in the same way as everyone else. So, the types of initiatives that I've been involved in over the last 2.5 years have spanned everything from working with the British Beer and Pub Association to encourage them to have more accessible pubs and bars across the UK. 20,000 pubs and bars across the UK now have guidance on how to make those spaces more accessible. I've worked with organisations like the Centre for Ageing Better to encourage them to look at how accessible and inclusive products can be designed, particularly for older people. And I think it's come up in some of the topics you've addressed as part of this radio event, that actually if you just design products well, with access in mind, you design naturally well for everybody. So those are the types of initiatives I've been involved in.
And it's not just designing well. I mean, it's fair to say that you want to design beautifully as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's been a core part of our ethos at MotionSpot since we set up the business in 2012. As I say, driven by James's experience that accessible spaces have tended in the past to feel second best in their design. It always tends to be a bit of an afterthought when it comes to the design of a building in particular. And as we know, there are, thousands of really talented, creative designers, both architects and interior designers out there. They just need a bit more confidence and knowledge as to how to design things to be accessible, spaces to be accessible for everybody, but do that in a creative way. Don't just tick a box and drag and drop the same pack of products into each clinical looking wheelchair accessible toilet. Let's bring a bit of fun. Let's bring a bit of creativity to it. So that's always been central to the work we do.
And certainly I understand that architects per se are problem solvers. They want to take a challenge and address it in as an innovative a way as possible. And so it should be seen as a real opportunity, Jane.
Oh, completely. And I just want to quote the National Disability Strategy. There's a couple of really good points in that. And the first one of them, it talks about the longer term ambition, putting disabled people at the heart of design and delivery of services, but also the call to action is that disability is everyone's business. And I think that's when architects can really, really help with this process. Take it on board, understand that we are not, I always say, we get young, we get old, we have children, we have temporary disabilities. We're all of us can be impacted by our built environment. We just need to be a bit more considerate of it.
Shani, if you can think, I'm sure you have loads of examples, but can you share an experience of a particularly bad design experience, like environment that you've had to navigate because, someone just simply, the designers behind just simply haven't thought enough about who is using this space? Can you share an example?
I've got so many, Marsha. I don't really know where to start. I think what I find challenging the most is even things like doorbells being out of reach or door knockers. And if I'm on my own, and I don't know, I don't have the number of where I need to go to or who to meet. I'm just stuck outside because, oh, actually, I've just thought of one as well. You know, automatic doors, they barely pick me up on the sensor. It's so annoying. And you know, some corridors and things are lit by sensors as well. I'm often left walking in the dark. So yeah, I could probably write a book, but there's so many different things.
But that's not just you. Presumably, that's the same for children as well. So, like, these designs just don't even take into account that we've got a population of children in our world.
And I guess people might think, well, children won't be unaccompanied, but I just think, you know, this market, you know, the disability market is rising on like 14% per year. That's estimated. And, you know, as we've all the speakers today have already spoken about, this could be one of us at any point. If we only design with the average person in mind, with all the biases that we have, and not thinking about the whole range of human diversity that exists, then we're really missing a trick. Like, yes, we could sit here and talk about the business case, but the moral reasons are even bigger. And as disabled people, when we have to navigate inaccessible transport, inaccessible leisure, inaccessible workplaces, our homes become our safe spaces. But, you know, my home isn't accessible, and because I rent, my hands are a bit tied in terms of what I can adapt as well. So now we are, you know, some people can't even leave their front door, you know. So I just think people need to think about how would they like to be treated, and their loved ones if they were in this similar position.
Jane, what actions would you like to see your colleagues of architects take in order to embrace, you know, the disability voice, not only in design, but in terms of those that employ, and engaging external stakeholders as well?
That's a big ask. Lots. I think what architects have got to do is step back and actually think, what can we do? How can we change things? And I know that if you employ a disabled person, the whole practice will learn from that person, and it becomes a self-perpetuating goal, really, for me. Please read the best practice standards. And I would also say around children's needs, we don't have any standards around children, disabled children or children. And as a nation, I think that's, you know, we're talking about the 9 protected characteristics, one of which is age. Think about disability in the sense of older people. They're your client's market. If you don't see that, then you're losing an awful lot. Think about the purple pound. It's massive. It's absolutely huge. I always say, because my husband lost the use of his left arm and hand through cancer, 2004, I think it was. And I quite often, when I do lectures, say to people, try to get yourself dressed with one hand tomorrow. Okay, see if you can do it. Sometimes you just got to get architects to sort of put themselves in that position. Just think about it. I don't say act it out, because I don't like that. That's horrible. But think about it. And people will suddenly, a little light bulb goes on. And once a light bulb goes on one thing, then they start to look at the other things as well. So it's just think about it. And call me anytime.
I'm with Shani, Danda, Jane Simpson and Ed Warner talking about disability in architecture. Coming up tomorrow, we have our first day talking CQ strategy. We'll be discussing inclusive recruitment with Pooja Agrawal of Public Practice and Dr. Bina Kandola of the consultancy Pern Kandola. He also wrote Racism at Work, The Danger of Indifference, so really good, alongside Dr. Susie Ridout. And earlier we were discussing socioeconomic diversity with architects Chris Hildry and Philip Watson, the GLA Deputy Mayor for Regeneration, Jules Pipe, and Karen Mosley, the Managing Director of HLM Architects. And you can hear all of that conversation again on this listen link as we repeat today's live content. I'm currently with Shani, Danda, Jane Simpson and Ed Warner, and we're talking about disability in architecture. And Ed, you know, one thing I've noticed, generally there's a great deal of fear about addressing a lot of diversity characteristics, and there's a real fear around getting it wrong. And we did look at that at CQ Drive Day, but what are your experiences of seeing architects talk about disability? Are they willing to engage in the area?
Absolutely. And we're seeing a much greater shift to architects being more aware that it needs to be planned in at a much earlier stage. And they're becoming more aware of who they're designing the buildings for. They're not just designing for one type of person. But there's an awful lot more that can be done. I think the fear comes about because architects don't want to be told when a building gets built that they've got something wrong. So often what they do is they just default to what they always have done, which has been signed off by building control, and they almost tick the box around accessibility. And just leading on from what Shani was saying, I think there'd be a great market, Shani, for your book around small design improvements that just make such a difference to people's lives, because it's actually those practical points that make such a difference in design. Our team were involved in a fascinating workshop just last week with a workplace client who got us in to look at their workplace and to teach them all the elements that could be designed better from an access perspective. And we coordinated a focus group of disabled people to be part of that session. And that really opened the architects' eyes, having disabled people engage in the workplace and just really show designers what some of the challenges were. So simple things like in kitchenettes, big workplace kitchenettes, all the mugs are at a certain height, all the teas, coffees are at a certain height, just bringing those down to a more accessible level, putting a small, upstand edge on a kitchen worktop so that if hot water from the cooker tap spills all over the worktop, it's not going to cover someone who's in a wheelchair. And what we saw from the focus group the day after was actually designers coming to us saying, oh, actually, we've thought about moving the books in the library bookshelves to the right accessible height. And we've started to colour contrast light switches so that anyone with a visual impairment can begin to pick out where it is. So it's really just giving people the confidence and knowledge as to where some of the challenges are and getting them to think about the solutions.
So, Shani, small design improvements. I think there's a great play on words there to help you. So you just need to find a publisher for that one. I mean, what other sort of thoughts and ideas and experiences do you think could be brought into that kind of thinking?
I think just involving a wide variety of disabled people, not just also sticking with the most common types either. And remember, like, yes, you will need to understand or think about some medical stuff in relation to disability at some level, but let's remember the social model, because that's going to help us to spot exclusion and then help us to remove the barriers. There's so many though, but what I've never really understood is if you're someone of a short stature like me, why do people put everything at like really high? Like, why do people put things out of reach? Because if you're tall, 9 times out of 10 you're going to be able to reach something that's lower than you. But if you're short, unless you carry a stool or a ladder around with you, which I don't, I can't reach things out of my reach. So there's another free tip.
Yeah, and actually, it's all about the data around what is the norm, what is the average, and there is no average. I mean, a great example of this is really, really well detailed in the book Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez, which I highly, highly recommend. Can make you a little bit angry when you start to realize the massive data gap between men and women. But certainly, women, if you were to have an average woman, is smaller than the average man. And so, of course, there's a huge number of women who are then even smaller again still. So there's a gender bias there as well. Jane, when you're, as part of your messaging around, accessibility and listening to that disability voice, what are the, you talked about standards. You do talk about standards, and you send me lots of really great emails about standards. What do people have to be thinking about here? Which are the key ideas and standards that exist that are already there, already providing that advice, already providing that guidance for best practice?
Loads. I mean, obviously the best one is BS 8300. There's part 1 and part 2. What I will say firstly is ADM in England, because bear in mind it varies throughout the UK, but in England it actually states at the beginning, meeting ADM does not necessarily constitute meeting equality legislation.
ADM, do you mind breaking that down for me?
Approved Document M of building regulations. And it tells you that that's probably not going to be sufficient. So getting a building regulation sign off is not enough. It's not sufficient. So you need to look at best practice. So you're looking at BS 8300. Sport England have got their own guidance. Arts Council have some guidance. There's inclusive mobility, which is externals. All of these are constantly being updated. I mean, I'm working at the moment representing RIBA on a PAS looking at electric charging stations, would you believe? So every single element in the built environment needs to be considered from an inclusive perspective. And I will say a word of warning to architects as well, it is cyclic. So your BS 8300 has been updated. ADM might not necessarily be the same. They may vary between them. So the designers have got to use all of those standards and sort of pick the bits that suit that particular situation. That is a designer's role, really. And yeah, BS 8300, Sport England, Sign Design Guide, Inclusive Mobility. There's a really good thing called Inclusive Projects, which was about how you should organise your project. And that's, I think it was 2007. I'd like somebody to rewrite that one, please. So if somebody wants to pick that one up and rewrite it, it'd be great.
Ed, I think you've got the government's ear. So when you're doing this work with government, you know, how do you see yourself moving forward with that, and what do you want to see change as a result of the advice that you're giving?
So my role in government actually ends in March of next year. So I'm on.
Hurry up, then.
I'm on a real push to try and get as much achieved before then as possible. I think from my perspective, what I see a lot of is there are a huge number of regulations out there, and if you've read BS 8300 or Part M, it's not the most enjoyable read. It is very text heavy, and it can be quite confusing for people who are new to this profession. Jane's been doing this for 30 years, and
sorry, Jane, for bringing that up again.
I'm sorry, Jane. You are the fairy godmother of accessibility standards. So, but there are not enough people out there like Jane who really know this detail inside out. And I think what we need to do is to educate and empower architects and designers to really understand the key principles. And the way of doing that is by engaging access specialists and access consultants, but also trying to put it in a more visual way for creative people. You know, if you ask a creative person to design accessibly and you give them 180 pages of text, it's going to be very difficult to get a creative output from that. So we're big believers in trying to really kind of visually inspire architects and designers to prove what's possible, to get across what those key design principles are, and do it in a way through photography and video and short case studies that just inspire thought and action, as opposed to asking someone to read however many pages of text.
Yeah, a really good point. And Jane, just not enough people out there like you. You know, how can you encourage others to be more Jane?
Well, I've been doing Part 2 and Part 3 lecturing for quite a while in schools of architecture, and I was approached by Thomas Kirby, if you're listening in, Tom, when he was doing his Part 2, and because of working with me, he went on to do inclusive design, looking at the Manchester Town Hall project, and he wants to become an NRAC consultant. We've already got Kate who's become an NRAC consultant at Haverstocks, so I would encourage more architects to think about doing that, think about becoming them. And I had a little message from a friend who said, don't forget to mention the PAS 6463 Design for the Mind, which is around neurodiversity. So I would say to people, keep your eyes open. And one thing I did want to mention, which I got scribbled down here, I'm not sure if it's the right time, but I've been doing some lectures with Helen Taylor from Scott Brownrigg on inclusive educational buildings. And we asked the architects listening in, what stops you from doing inclusive buildings? And generally, when you got a larger group, because it's very difficult when you get a small group, larger group, it's split a third, knowledge, client, and availability of funds. So it's not just about getting the knowledge to the architects and get the architects to accept it. We need the clients to understand that it's important, and we need the money to be available to do inclusive buildings.
Shani, if I can give you the last word, just not enough people out there doing it. What would you say to them?
I think we need to understand it's our collective responsibility, to remove barriers, and it's in our own self-interest to be an ally to people from, not only diverse and oppressed groups but disabled communities, and ultimately our struggles are tied to everybody else's. So every decision that we make either raises or lowers barriers to participation in society. This is, the power and responsibility I really believe architects need to understand that they have. And I guess my question back to the community is, what action will you all take now?
What action will you all take now? Thanks to Shani, Danda, Jane Simpson and Ed Warner talking about disability in architecture.
Take a chance. Enter the RIBA Radio Lucky Prize draw.
We have 2 fabulous prizes to give away. Win a 2-night stay for you and a friend or lover in one of Mallinson's gorgeous woodland tree houses. They're uniquely designed. They're funky luxury retreats. They have fab things for a pampering stay like hot tubs, saunas, cargo net daybeds, and they are suspended over a stream beneath an oak canopy. And wood-burning stoves if it's chilly. What's not to love? That would be a great prize, right? And you could also be with the opportunity to win tickets to see the Specials live. Their show next July in Dublin. It sold out ages ago, but we've managed to secure 2 tickets for our lucky winners, plus a night stay at a hotel of your choice in Dublin, up to the value of £200. Saturday, the 2nd of July 2022, Trinity College Dublin is for the diary. To enter the draw, go to the RIBA Radio webpage on architecture.com and just fill in the form. You need a magic word, and the magic word is giraffe. Giraffe. I came up with that, I think. Don't ask me why. The winners will be announced live during the last RIBA Radio broadcast this Friday. Plus, each entry will receive a limited edition booklet that folds out in a unique way to reveal a striking and beautifully designed A2 poster with 10 top tips for inclusion, written by me, so you must get one. It's an absolute must for your office wall. Full terms and conditions can be found at architecture.com. Wow. It's been another amazing day, another cracking day on RIBA Radio. We've been exploring the lived experiences of socioeconomically disadvantaged, LGBTQ plus lives. That was a really powerful discussion, hearing about all those different kinds of experiences and disability. All of that on day 4 CQ Knowledge. We've heard from Chris Hildry, Jules Pipe, Philip Watson, Karen Mosley, Adam Nathaniel Furman, Joshua Mardell, Tabs and Christina Riley, as well as Shani, Danda, Jane Simpson and Ed Warner. Thank you so much once again for listening to RIBA Radio. All of this is about helping you move forward with your inclusion journey. Very grateful as ever to the team here for bringing it all together. I'm Marsha Ramroop. I'm the Director of Inclusion here at the RIBA. I will be with you again tomorrow from 9 with CQ and CQ Cultural Intelligence, the capability to work and relate effectively with those who are different from you. CQ Strategy Planning, Checking and Awareness. We're talking about inclusive recruitment, architecture education, assumptions outside London, and planning around the menopause. All of that to come on RIBA Radio.
You've been listening to RIBA Radio. Real, inclusive, brilliant action.